1874. Bakunin, among others, had long been urging the educated youth to go to the people, to immerse themselves in the life of the peasants, and in the mad summer of 1874, several thousand of them attempted to do just that. Leaving their homes, schools, and universities, they fanned out to the countryside to make direct contact with the Russian people. The movement was not a conspiracy, and the populists, as they came to be called, had no organizational center or direction. Some sought primarily to renounce their relative comforts and privileges and thereby give their lives greater meaning. Others, following the precepts of Peter Levrov, viewed their mission as an educational one, a matter of preaching socialism to the peasants and, as we would term it today, raising their consciousness. Still others, however, agreed with Bakunin's criticism of this program and sought to exhort and galvanize the peasants to insurrection on the model of the Razin and Pugachev uprisings. Unsurprisingly, the episode ended badly for its participants, and many hundreds of them were soon rounded up by the Tsarist police. The influence of statism and anarchy on the To the People movement was attested by a number of contemporary Russian activists. It was confirmed by the Minister of Justice himself, who, in a memorandum on the movement, attributed a particularly nefarious influence to Bakunin's writings and followers, perhaps the highest accolade a Russian revolutionary could receive. 34 Just how quickly and widely the book was disseminated can be judged by one curious example recently unearthed from the Tsarist archives. In June of 1874, one Ivan Pisarov, the owner of an estate in the Yaroslavl province, northeast of Moscow, was investigated by the police. The investigation established that among other suspicious activities, Ivan Pisarov had been circulating a small library of subversive literature, including Bakunin's Statism and Anarchy 35. Although anti-state sentiment had been a marked feature of Russian revolutionary thought long before the appearance of statism and anarchy, the work helped to lay the foundations of a Russian anarchist movement as a separate current within the revolutionary stream. As in the West, the anarchists in Russia remained a minority voice among the radicals. Lacking any broad opportunity to put their own ideals into practice, one of their most important historical functions was to serve as critics of the more numerous and better organized Marxists. Reiterating and developing Bakunin's insight into the authoritarian proclivities of revolutionary intellectuals, they came to serve as a kind of conscience of the left. This role assumed particular relevance, as well as danger, when the Russian state in 1917 became the first to be ruled by avowed Marxists. Applying to the conditions of Soviet Russia their familiar warnings concerning the rise of a new socialist elite, anarchists were among the first critics of the Bolshevik dictatorship, and they were also among its first victims. 36 In a larger perspective, anarchism's foremost contribution to modern political thought has also, perhaps, been its critical voice. Whatever else anarchism might stand for, its defining feature is negation of the state and of political relationships. Consequently, anarchism has served the useful and provocative purpose of challenging the very validity of politics, the legitimacy of the political sphere of human life. It asks the simple but searching question, is man by nature made to live in a polis? One may or may not agree with the answer anarchism itself has given. By persistently and vigorously raising the question, however, anarchism, it might be said, has served as the conscience of political thought. One contribution to La Biographie de Michel Bakunin, La Société Nouvelle, September 1896, pages 312. To A. Kornilov, Molody Godin Mikhaila Bakunina. Istoria Ruskого Romantisma, Moscow, Ist. M.I.S. Sabashnikova, 1915, pages 195-97, 231-32. Arthur Lenin, Bakunin's Conceptions of Revolutionary Organizations and Their Role, A Study of the Secret Societies, in C. Abramsky, and Essays in Honor of E. H. Carr, London, Macmillan, 1974, pages 57-58. 3. The best description of Moscow's intellectual life in this period appears in parts 1 to 4 of Alexander Herzen's memoirs, My Past and Thoughts, Trends, by Constance Garnett, revised by Humphrey Higgins, with an introduction by Isaiah Berlin, 4 vols. New York, Knopf, 1968. A good introduction to the subject is Isaiah Berlin, A Marvelous Decade, 1838-48, The Birth of the Russian Intelligentsia, in Sydney Harcade, and Readings in Russian History, 2 vols. New York, Crowell, 1962, 1, pages 34-62. Reprinted in Isaiah Berlin, Russian Thinkers, New York, Viking, 1978, pages 114-35. For Martin Malia, Alexander Herzen and the Birth of Russian Socialism, 1812-1855, Cambridge, Massachusetts Harvard University Press, 1961, is the best discussion of the role of idealist philosophy in Russia. 5. Martin del Giudice, Bakunin's preface to Hegel's Gymnasium lectures The Problem of Alienation and the Reconciliation with Reality, Canadian-American Slavic Studies, 16, 2, Summer 1982, 161-89. 6m. A. Bakunin, Sobrany Sokonany I Pisem, 1828-1876, and U.M. Stiklov, 4 vols. Moscow, is the 10th Volksnovo Общество Polkators Sana Postolentsov, 1934-35, 111, pages 415. 7. The Confession of Mikhail Bakunin. With the marginal comments of by Nicholas I, translated by Robert C. House, with an introduction and notes by Lawrence D. Orton, Ithaca, Cornell University Press, 1977, pages 92. 8. James M. Eddy et al., eds. Russian Philosophy, 3 vols. Chicago, Quadrangle Books, 1965, 1, pages 385, 403-06. 9. Empiromova, Bakunin, Moscow, Molodaya Tvrdia, 1970, pages 72. 10. Bakunin, Confession, pages 56. 11. Bakunin, Sobrany Sokonany, 111, pages 357. 12. For an account of the publication and impact of the appeal, see Lawrence D. Orton, The Echo of Bakunin's Appeal to the Slavs, 1848, Canadian-American Slavic Studies, 10. 4. Winter 1976, 489-501. 13. Richard Wagner, My Life, authorized translation from the German, 2 vols. New York, Dodd, Mead, 1911, 1, pages 467. 14. Ibid, pages 492. For Wagner's account of Bakunin's participation in the insurrection, see Ibid, pages 478-99. Bakunin, Confession, pages 147-48. 15. Bakunin, Confession, pages 91. 16. Ibid, pages 103. 17. MP Dragomanov, and Pisama M.A. Bakunina K.A. Agertsenu INPO Garavu, Geneva, Georgiev, Colorado, 1896, pages 72. 18. Bakunin, Sobrany Sokonany, 4, pages 245. 19. Dragomanov, and Pisama, pages 172-74. 20. T.R. Ravindranathan, Bakunin in Naples, An Assessment, Journal of Modern History, 53, 2, June 1981, 201m. 42. 21. For a biography of Nechayev, see Philip Pomper, Sergei Nechayev, New Brunswick, N.J. Rutgers University Press, 1979. 22. The documentation is provided in Arthur Lenning, and Archives Bakunin. 4. Michel Bakunin et ses relations avec Sergei Messiaen, 1870-1872, Leiden, Brill, 1971, and Michael Confino, Violence Dans Love Islands, Le Débat Bakunin Messiaen, Paris, Maspero, 1973. 23. Dragomanov, and Pisama, pages 300. 24. Pages 321. 25. Arthur Lenning, and Archives Bakunin, 6. Michel Bakunin sur la guerre franco-allemande et la révolution sociale en France, 1870-1871, Leiden, Brill, 1977, pages 20. 26. Ibid, p. XLIX. 27. Ibid, pages 145. 28. A detailed history of the International from the anarchist point of view, which includes a good deal of information about Bakunin himself, is James Blount, L'Internationale, Documents et Souvenirs, 1864-1878, 4 vols. Paris, 1905-10. 29. Arthur Lenning, N. Archives Bakunin, 11. Michel Bakunin et les Conflits L'Internationale, 1872, Latin, Brill, 1965, p. XXVIN. 1. 30. Michael Armeris, Popular Anti-Semitism, and Philip Dennis Cate, The Paris Cry, Graphic Artists and the Dreyfus Affair, in Norman Leiblatt, and The Dreyfus Affair, Art, Truth and Justice, Berkeley, University of California Press, 1987, pages 50-61, 62-95. 31. Von Speck von Bakunin's Buch Stottleitscheidung. Anarchy, in Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, work, XVII, Berlin, Dietz Verlag, 1981, pages 634. 32. Letter to Herzen and O'Gara, July 19, 1866, in Dragomanot, and Pisama, pages 176-77. 33. Arthur Lenning, N. Archives Bakunin, 3. Edetism et Anarchy, 1873, Latin, Brill, 1967, p. XXIV. The work was reprinted in 1906 in St. Petersburg. Editions were also published in Russia in 1919 and 1922, but without appendices A and B. 34. On the contemporary impact of statism and anarchy, see Ibid, PPXXVXXVI, and Franco Venturi, Roots of Revolution, A History of the Populist and Socialist Movements in 19th Century Russia, translated by Francis Haskell, London, Wadenfeld and Nick Olson, 1960, pages 438, 506. 35. Daniel Field, Peasants and Propagandists in the Russian Movement to the People of 1874, Journal of Modern History, 59, 3, September 1987, 419-20. 36. Paul Avrich, N. The Anarchists in the Russian Revolution, Ithaca, Cornell University Press, 1973. The American Anarchist and the Golden Within Russia in 1920 and 1921, and her autobiography, Living My Life, 2 vols. New York, Knopf, 1931, contains a vivid account of those years. Even within the Communist Party itself, left-wing critics of official policies in the early years of Bolshevik rule frequently voiced sentiments the anarchists had been expressing for years. See Robert Vincent Daniels, The Conscience of the Revolution, Communist Opposition in Soviet Russia, Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1960. Principal events in Bakunin's life. Events occurring within Russia are dated according to the old-style calendar then in effect, which in the 19th century was 12 days behind the Western calendar. The latter is used for events occurring outside Russia. 1814, 1828, 1835, 1836, 1838, 1840. May 18, born at Kryamykino, Tver province. Goes to St. Petersburg to study at artillery school. Retires from military service. Moves to Moscow, joins Stankovic Circle. March, publishes Preface to Hegel's Gymnasium Lectures. June, leaves Russia to study philosophy in Berlin. 1842, 1843, 1844, 1847, 1848. October, publishes Reaction in Germany. Moves to Zurich, meets Wilhelm Weitling. February, ordered home by Russian government. Settles in Paris, meets Marx and Proudhon. December, decree of Russian Senate strips him of noble status, sentences him in absentia to hard labor in Siberia. November 29, speaks at Polish banquet in Paris. December, expelled from France, moves to Brussels. February, returns to Paris after February Revolution. March, travels to Germany. June, participates in Slav Congress and insurrection in Prague. December, publishes Appeal to the Slavs. 1849 May, participates in Dresden insurrection. 1849-51. Tried and sentenced to death in Saxony, extradited to Austria. Tried and sentenced to death in Austria, extradited to Russia. 1851 A. Incarcerated in Peter Paul Fortress, St. Petersburg. July-August, writes confession. 1854 March, transferred to Schlüsselburg Fortress. February 18, 1855, death of Nicholas I. 1857 March, released from prison, exiled to Siberia. October 5, 1858, marries Antonia Kwiatkowska and Tomsk. 1861, 1862, 1863, 1864. July, escapes from Siberia. Sails via Japan to San Francisco. November-December, visits New York, Boston, Cambridge. December 27, arrives in London, joins Herzen and O'Gara. Publishes to Russian, Polish, and other Slav friends in the People's Cause, Romanov, Pavlicek, or Pistol? January, Polish insurrection against Russia begins. February, leaves London to join Polish expedition for landing on Lithuanian coast. April-October, in Stockholm, gives speeches and writes articles on behalf of Polish Revolution. Reunited with his wife. January, arrives in Italy, visits Garibaldi, settles in Florence. 1865, 1866, 1867, 1868, 1869. September-November, travels to Stockholm and London, meets Marx again and joins International. Moves to Naples. Founds International Brotherhood. September, moves to Switzerland, joins League of Peace and Freedom. Writes Federalism, Socialism, and Anti-Theologism. Joins Geneva section of International. Leaves League of Peace and Freedom, forms Alliance of Social Democracy. March, begins collaboration with Nietzsche. September, attends Basel Congress of International. Settles in Locarno. 1870 June, breaks relations with Nietzsche. September 2nd, defeat of France by Prussia at Sedan. Publishes letters to a Frenchman. September 15th, arrives in Lyons to participate in insurrection. 1870-71. Writes the Nato-Germanic Empire, including section published posthumously as God and the State. 1871 March-May, Paris Commune. Writes the Paris Commune and the Idea of the State. Publishes the Political Theology of Mazzini in the International. 1872. September, expelled from International at the Hague Congress. 1873, 1874, 1876. Publishes Statism and Anarchy. July-August, travels to Bologna to participate in aborted insurrection. Moves to Lugano. July 1st, dies in Bern. Bibliographical note. Bakunin's writings. Most of Bakunin's works and letters are still available only in Russian or French. Relatively little has been translated into English. The following are the two major editions of his works. Bakunin, Michel. Obras, works. Edited by Max Mitlau and James Guillaume. 6. Vols. Paris. Stock, 1895 to 1913. The series was left incomplete, but it remains the best starting point for an examination of Bakunin's anarchist writings. Lenin, Arthur, N. Archives Bakunin, The Bakunin Archives. 7 vols, in 8. Leiden. Brill, 1961. An ongoing series. Beautifully edited and produced. Each volume focuses on a particular topic and contains original text, with French translations, where required, supplementary material, and extensive annotations. The volumes today deal with the years 1870 and after. A less expensive edition of the series is being issued in Paris, Editions Champ-Libre, 1973. There are 2 other major collections, Bakunin, M.A. Sobrany Sokanani Pisem, 1828-1876, Collected Works and Letters. Edited by U.M. Stiklov, 4 vols. Moscow, is detailstwo Soizerbo Obshestva Polkaters Sana Basilentsov, 1934-35. This collection brings together all of Bakunin's available letters and works from 1828 to 1861 and is very thoroughly annotated. Like the Netlaugilam Ufras, the series was left incomplete, but it is the only collection that covers Bakunin's early years. It has been reprinted in Vaduz, Liechtenstein, Era Printing Establishment, 1970. Dragomanov, M.P., and Pisma M.A. Bakunina Kilampir. Igrsenu Inpo Garabu, Letters of M.A. Bakunin to A.I. Herzin and N.P. Ogarov. Geneva, Georgit, Colorado, 1896. Contains Bakunin's letters to Herzin and Ogarov from 1860 to 1874, along with extensive appendices of Bakunin's writings and speeches. The 1968 reprint by Mouton, The Hague, is of the second edition, published in 1906 in St. Petersburg, which omitted the appendices. There are also German and French editions. Aside from the present volume, the list of complete writings by Bakunin available in English is very short. Bakunin, Michael. God in the State. With an introduction by Paul Avrich. New York, Dover, 1970. An unpublished segment of the Nato-Germanic Empire and the Social Revolution, this became the most famous piece of writing by Bakunin. Other editions are also available. Confino, Michael, and Daughter of A. Revolutionary, Natalie Herzin and the Bakunin Nechayev Circle. Translated by Hilary Sternberg and Lydia Bott. La Salle, in Library Press, 1973. A collection of documents which includes a number of letters of 1870 by Bakunin. The Confession of Mikhail Bakunin. With the marginal comments of Tsar Nicholas I translated by Robert C. Howes. Introduction and notes by Lawrence D. Orton. Ithaca, Cornell University Press, 1977. A well-translated and well-annotated edition of this important document. Bakunin, Mikhail. From Out of the Dustbin, Bakunin's Basic Writings, 1869 to 1871. Translated and edited by Robert M. Cutler. Ann Arbor, Artist, 1985. A volume of Bakunin's journalistic writings, well-translated and with a useful scholarly apparatus. The following are anthologies of excerpts from Bakunin's writings. Maximov, G.P., and The Political Philosophy of Bakunin, Scientific Anarchism. Glencoe, Illinois Free Press, 1953. A compilation of bits and snippets of Bakunin's works, arranged topically. Dolgov, Sam, Trends and Ed. Bakunin on Anarchy. New York, Knopf, 1972. Extracts from a variety of writings drawn from Bakunin's entire career. Lenin, Arthur, and Michael Bakunin, Selected Writings. Translated by Stephen Cox and Olive Stevens, London, Jonathan Cape, 1973. Sizable selections constituting a representative sample of Bakunin's most important works. The following contains significant selections from Bakunin's writings. Eddie, James M. et al., eds. Russian Philosophy 3 vols. Chicago, Quadrangle Books, 1965. Volume 1 contains the reaction in Germany in entirety and excerpts from the Paris Commune and the idea of a state and God in a state. Schatz, Marshall S. and The Essential Works of Anarchism. New York, Bantam Books, 1971. Includes excerpts from God and the State and Statism and Anarchy. Works on Bakunin. The following are some of the most useful and significant writings about Bakunin in English. Avrich, Paul. The Russian Anarchists. Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1967. A Comprehensive History of the Russian Anarchist Movement. Bakunin and Nechayev. London, Freedom Press, 1974. A convenient summary of the relationship, taking the latest research into account. Republished in Avrich, Anarchist Portraits, see below, pages 32 to 52. Bakunin and the United States. International Review of Social History, 24, 1979, 320-40. reprinted in Average, Anarchist Portraits, pages 16 to 31. Bakunin sojourned in America in 1861, and his impact on the American anarchist movement. Anarchist Portraits. Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1988. A collection of articles on anarchist figures, including several on Bakunin. Berlin, Isaiah. Herzen and Bakunin on Individual Liberty. In Ernest J. Simmons, N. Continuity and Change in Russian and Soviet Thought. Cambridge, Massachusetts, Harvard University Press, 1955, pages 473 to 99. Reprinted in Isaiah, Berlin, Russian Thinkers. New York, Viking, 1978, pages 82 to 113. Argues that Herzen was more the true libertarian than Bakunin. Brown, Edward J. Stankovich and his Moscow Circle, 1830-1840. Stanford University Press, 1966. Depicts the young Bakunin in the context of the Russian intelligentsia. Canadian-American Slavic Studies, 10, 4, Winter 1976, Special Issue, Michael. Bakunin. Articles on various aspects of his life and activities. Carr, E. H. Michael Bakunin. London, Macmillan, 1937. Reprinted New York, Octagon Books, 1975. Still the most detailed and readable biography of Bakunin in English, but trivializes its subject and neglects even to mention statism and anarchy. Cochrane, Stephen T. The Collaboration of Messiaen, Ogarev and Bakunin in 1869, Messiaen's Early Years. Astra Studium der Hochschulen des Rheinhessen, Sir 2, Marburger Abhandlungen zur Geschichte und Kultur Osteuropas, Volume 18. Gießen, Wilhelm Schnitt Verlag, 1977. Carefully examines the contribution of each of the three to the literature produced during the collaboration. Cole, GDHA History of Socialist Thought, Volume 11, Marxism and Anarchism, 1850-1890. London, Macmillan, 1954. A good summary of Bakunin's ideas in a classic work. Del Giudice, Martine. Bakunin's preface to Hegel's Gymnasium lectures the problem of alienation and the reconciliation with reality. Canadian-American Slavic Studies, 16, 2, Summer 1982, 161-89. A penetrating analysis of Bakunin's 1838 essay. Eisenwein, George R. Anarchist Ideology and the Working Class Movement in Spain, 1868-1898. Berkeley, University of California Press, 1989. Details Bakunin's influence on the ideological development of Spanish anarchism. Girth, Hans, ed. and trans. Minutes of the Hague Congress of 1872 with related documents. Madison, University of Wisconsin Press, 1958. The proceedings of the Congress at which Bakunin was expelled from the International. Handlin, Oscar, ed. A Russian Anarchist Visits Boston New England Quarterly, 15, 1, March 1942, 104-09. A first-hand account by Martin P. Kennard, of Boston. Businessman. Herzen, Alexander. My Past and Thoughts. Translated by Constance Garnett, revised by Humphrey Higgins, with an introduction by Isaiah Berlin. 4 vols. New York, Knopf, 1968. Volume 3 contains an oft-quoted character sketch of Bakunin. Hostetter, Richard. The Italian Socialist Movement. Origins, 1860-1882. Princeton, New Jersey, Van Nostrand, 1958. Contains a good deal of information on Bakunin's activities in Italy and his impact on the early years of Italian socialism. Kaplan, Timma. Anarchists of Andalusia, 1868-1903. Princeton, N.J. Princeton University Press, 1977. Briefly traces Bakunin's influence in Spain. Kelly, Eileen. Mikhail Bakunin, A Study in the Psychology and Politics of Utopianism. Oxford, Clarendon Press, 1982. An intellectual and psychological biography, informative but hostile to its subject. Benefic, K.J. Michael Bakunin and Karl Marx. Melbourne, 1948. A sympathetic treatment of Bakunin's views. Lampert, E Studies in Rebellion. London, Routledge and Kegan-Paul, 1957. Contains a substantial chapter on Bakunin which emphasizes his darker sides. Lenning, Arthur. Bakunin's Conceptions of Revolutionary Organizations and Their Role, a Study of His Secret Societies. In C. Abramsky, and Essays in Honor of E. H. Carr. London, Macmillan, 1974, pages 57 to 81. Sorts out the welter of conspiratorial groups Bakunin created in his anarchist period. McClellan, Woodford. Revolutionary Exiles, the Russians in the First International and the Paris Commune. London, Frank Cass, 1979. The Russian revolutionaries in Switzerland, concentrating on those who supported Marx and the International. Meyer, J.M. Knowledge and Revolution, the Russian colony Innsbruck, 1870 to 1873. Assen, Van Gorkum, 1955. The Russian student colony on the eve of the To the People movement, with particular attention to the influence of Bakunin and Lavrov. Mendel, Arthur. Michael Bakunin, Roots of Apocalypse. New York, Prager, 1981. An unconvincing attempt at a psychobiography. Pizier, Eugene. The Doctrine of Anarchism of Michael A. Bakunin. Milwaukee, Marquette University Press, 1955. A superficial analysis, which finds that Bolshevism was the fulfillment of Bakunin's ideas. Rabindranath, T.R. Bakunin and the Italians. Montreal, McGill Queen's University Press, 1989. A detailed and well-informed study of Bakunin's views in Italy and his influence on Italian socialism. Saltman, Richard B. The Social and Political Thought of Michael Bakunin. Westport, Connecticut Greenwood Press, 1983. Attempts to define Bakunin's concept of freedom, relying heavily on English language compilations of Bakunin's writings. Schatz, Marshall S. Michael Bakunin and his biographers, The Question of Bakunin's Sexual Impotence. In Ezra Mendelsohn and Marshall S. Schatz, Ens, Imperial Russia, 1700 to 1917, State, Society, Opposition. Essays in Honor of Mark Rape. DeKalb, Illinois Northern Illinois University Press, 1988, pages 219 to 40. Deflates some of the myths about Bakunin that have taken root in the historical literature. Thomas, Paul. Karl Marx and the Anarchists. London, Routledge and Kegan-Paul, 1980. Contains a lengthy section on Bakunin and Marx, in the context of Marx's critique of anarchism. Venturi, Franco, Roots of Revolution, a history of the populist and socialist movements in 19th century Russia. Translated from the Italian by Francis Haskell, with an introduction by Isaiah Berman. London, Rodham Felden. Nick Olson, 1960. An exhaustive history of the Russian revolutionary movement to 1881, with informative chapters on Bakunin's role in it. For additional references, the reader may turn to two useful bibliographies, Average, Paul. Bakunin and His Writings. Canadian-American Slavic Study. 10. 4. Winter 1976. 591-96. A survey of the state of the literature by and about Bakunin as of mid-1970s. Cutler, Robert M. and Mikhail Bakunin, From Out of the Dustbin, see above, bibliography, pages 225 to 41. Contains a particularly extensive list of secondary works, including a number of obscure items. Note on the translation, the Russian title Bakunin gave his work, Gosudars I Anarchia, can be rendered into English in several different ways. It is clear from the text that Bakunin uses the word anarchia, or anarchy, not to mean chaos or disorder but in the sense that we would use anarchism today. Gosudars, however, can mean statism, in the sense of governmentalism, or it can mean statehood, and occasionally Bakunin also uses it to mean simply the state. As a result, the title is sometimes given as statehood and anarchy, or even as statism and anarchism. It seems to me that Bakunin most often uses the word in reference to belief in, or adherence to, the state, the statism, to which he opposes his own belief in anarchism. Therefore, I have translated it statism, while retaining, at the sacrifice of symmetry, the word anarchy which Bakunin chose to use. The original 1873 edition of Statism and Anarchy is a bibliographical wordy today. I have used the text established according to the original edition by Arthur Lenny in his Archives Bakunin, 3, Editism et Anarchy, 1873, Latin, Brill, 1967, pages 1 to 181. Only one attempt at a complete English translation has been made before, M. A. Bakunin, Statism and Anarchy, translated by C. H. Plummer, edited with an introduction by J. F. Harrison, New York, Revisionist Press, 1976. This translation is so faulty, however, as to be virtually unusable. Otherwise, the work has been available in English until now only in the form of excerpts. Bakunin did not divide the book into chapters or parts. For ease of reading and reference, I have created a few breaks in the text where the subject matter seemed to allow it. Footnotes marked with an asterisk are Bakunin's. Footnotes designated by letter A have been supplied by the translator to explain certain terms Bakunin used and, where possible, to correct misstatements of historical fact or obvious misprints in the text. All of the endnotes are by the translator. In transliterating Russian names, I have used the Library of Congress system in bibliographical citations but more conventional spelling in the text for the sake of readability. Statism and Anarchy: The Struggle of the Two Parties in the International Working Men's Association, 4 words. The International Working Men's Association, which came into being scarcely 9 years ago, has now attained such influence on the practical development of economic, social, and political issues throughout Europe that no political commentator or statesman can henceforth deny his most serious, and frequently anxious, attention. The official, semi-official, and bourgeois world in general, the world of the fortunate exploiters of manual labor, views it with the kind of inner foreboding one experiences at the approach of a still mysterious and ill-defined but highly threatening danger. It regards the International as a monster that will surely devour the entire social, economic, and state order unless a series of energetic measures is taken simultaneously in all the countries of Europe to put an end to its rapid progress. As we know, upon the conclusion of the recent war, which shattered the historic supremacy of the French state in Europe and replaced it with the even more odious and pernicious supremacy of state-supported pan-Germanism, measures against the international became a favorite topic of intergovernmental discussions. This is perfectly natural. By nature mutually antagonistic and utterly irreconcilable, states can find no other ground for joint action than the concerted enslavement of the masses who constitute the overall basis and purpose of their existence. Prince Bismarck, of course, has been and will remain the chief instigator and moving spirit behind this new holy alliance. But he was not the first to come forward with this proposal. He ceded the dubious honor of taking this initiative to the humiliated government of the French state which he had just routed. The foreign minister of the pseudo-national government, a true traitor to the Republic but a faithful friend and protector of the Jesuit order, believing in God but scorning mankind, and scorned in turn by all honest defenders of the people's cause, the notorious rhetorician Jules Favre, who seeks only to better the honor of being the prototype of all lawyers, with pleasure took upon himself the role of malicious slanderer and denouncer. Among the members of the so-called Government of National Defense, he was without a doubt one of those who contributed most to the disarming of the national defense and the patently treasonous surrender of Paris to its arrogant, insolent, and merciless conqueror when Prince Bismarck made a fool of him and abused him publicly. Yet, as though taking pride in his twofold shame, his own and that of France, which he had betrayed and maybe even sold out, impelled at one and the same time by a desire to please the great chancellor of the victorious German Empire who had put him to shame, and by his profound hatred of the proletariat in general and the world of the Paris workers in particular, Favre formally denounced the International, whose members, standing at the head of the working masses in France, had tried to provoke a national uprising against both the German conquerors and France's domestic exploiters, rulers, and traitors. a horrible crime, for which official, or bourgeois, friends had to punish the people's friends with exemplary severity. Thus the first word uttered by the French state on the morrow of its terrible and ignominious defeat was a word of illicit reaction. Who has not read Faber's memorable circular, in which crude lies and even cruder ignorance yield only to the impotent and frenzied malice of a Republican renegade? To it is the desperate will not of a single individual but of the whole of bourgeois civilization, which has depleted everything on earth and is condemned to death by its own ultimate exhaustion. Sensing the approach of its inevitable demise, with malicious desperation it latches onto anything that might prolong its pernicious existence. It appeals for help to all the idols of the past which bourgeois civilization itself once overthrew: God, the Church, the Pope, patriarchal right, and, above all, as its most reliable means of salvation, police protection and military dictatorship, even though it be Prussian, as long as it safeguards honest people from the terrifying threat of social revolution. Faber's circular found an echo, and where do you think? In Spain. Sagasta, the ephemeral minister of the ephemeral Spanish king Amadeo, also wanted to please Prince Bismarck and immortalize his own name freely to proclaim the crusade against the International. Not contenting himself, though, with feeble and fruitless measures which elicited only the derisive laughter of the Spanish proletariat, he also wrote a bombastic diplomatic circular. What he got for it, however, doubtless with the approval of Prince Bismarck and his junior assistant Faber, was a well-deserved dressing down from the more circumspect and less free government of Great Britain, and a few months later he was overthrown. It appears, however, that Sagasta's note, though it spoke in the name of Spain, was conceived, if not composed, in Italy, under the direct supervision of the highly experienced King Victor Emmanuel, the lucky father of the luckless Amadeo. In Italy, persecution of the International came from three different quarters. First, as one would have expected, it was damned by the Pope himself. He did it in a most original fashion, in one general anathema lumping together all members of the International with Freemasons, Jacobins, Rationalists, Deists, and Liberal Catholics, for according to the Holy Father as definition, anyone who does not blindly submit to his divinely inspired tirades belongs to this outcast association. 26 years ago, a Prussian general defined communism in exactly the same way. Do you know what being a communist means? He said to his soldiers, "It means thinking and acting contrary to the royal thought and will of His Majesty the King." It was not just the Roman Catholic Pope, however, who damned the International. Working Men's Association. The celebrated revolutionary Giuseppe Mazzini is much better known in Russia as an Italian patriot, conspirator, and agitator than as a metaphysician and deist and founder of a new church in Italy. But Mazzini himself, in 1871, right after the defeat of the Paris Commune, at the very moment when the brutal executors of the brutal Versailles decrees were shooting the Decemvir communards by the thousands, deemed it useful and necessary to add to the Roman Catholic anathema and the state's police persecution his own malediction, supposedly patriotic and revolutionary but in essence utterly bourgeois and, moreover, theological. 5 He hoped his words would suffice to kill all sympathy in Italy for the Paris Commune and to nip in the bud the sections of the International that had just been formed there. Exactly the opposite happened. Nothing fostered the growth of such sympathy in the proliferation of the International sections as much as his loud and solemn malediction. The Italian government, hostile to the Pope but even more hostile to Mazzini, was not asleep either. At first it did not understand the danger the International posed as it rapidly spread not just in the towns but even in the villages of Italy. It thought the new association would merely serve to counteract the progress of Mazzini's bourgeois republican propaganda, and in this regard it was not mistaken. But it quickly became convinced that propagandizing the principles of social revolution amidst an impassioned population which has been reduced to the utmost poverty and oppression by the government itself was more dangerous than all of Mazzini's political agitation and undertakings. The death of the great Italian patriot, which ensued soon after his angry outburst against the Paris Commune and the International, set the Italian government's mind at rest as far as the Mazzini party is concerned. Without its leader it henceforth will not pose the least danger to the government. It has visibly begun to disintegrate, and since its principles and its objectives, as well as its entire membership, are purely bourgeois. It is manifesting unmistakable symptoms of the decrepitude that afflicts all bourgeois initiatives in our time. The International's propaganda and organization in Italy are something else again. The International addresses itself directly and exclusively to the milieu of the common laborer, which in Italy as in every other country of Europe concentrates within itself all the life, strength, and future of contemporary society. Its only allies from the bourgeois world are those few individuals who have come to hate the existing political, economic, and social order heart and soul, who have turned their backs on the class that begot them and have devoted themselves utterly to the people's cause. Such people are few, but they are precious, though, it goes without saying, only when they have learned to hate the general bourgeois desire to dominate and have suppressed within themselves the last vestiges of personal ambition. In such cases, I repeat, they are truly precious. The people give them life, elemental force, and a firm basis. In return, they bring the people practical knowledge, the habit of abstraction and analysis, and the ability to organize and form associations. These in turn create the conscious fighting force without which victory is inconceivable. In Italy, as in Russia, quite a sizable number of young people of this kind have turned up, far more than in any other country. What is incomparably more important, however, is that Italy has a huge proletariat, endowed with an extraordinary degree of native intelligence but largely illiterate and wholly destitute. It consists of 2 or 3 million urban factory workers and small artisans, and some 20 million landless peasants. As I have already said, the oppressive and thieving government of the upper classes, under the liberal scepter of the king, the liberator and gatherer of the Italian 9-6, has reduced this whole countless mass of people to such desperate straits that even those who defend the present government and have a personal interest in it, are beginning to admit, and to say out loud both in Parliament and in official journals, that it is impossible to proceed any further along this road, and that something must be done for the people before they go on a devastating rampage. Indeed, perhaps nowhere else is social revolution as imminent as it is in Italy, not even in Spain, even though in Spain an official revolution is taking place while in Italy everything seems to be quiet. In Italy the people as a whole expect a social upheaval and consciously strive for it every day. You can imagine what a wide, sincere, and passionate welcome the Italian proletariat gave to the program of the International. Unlike many other countries of Europe, Italy does not have a separate stratum of workers who are to some degree privileged owing to their sizable wages, even boast of some literary education, and are so riddled with bourgeois principles, aspirations, and vanity as to be distinguishable from the bourgeoisie only by their circumstances, not by their sentiments. Particularly in Germany and Switzerland there are many such workers. In Italy, by contrast, there are very few, so few that they are lost in the crowd and have no influence at all. What predominates in Italy is that destitute proletariat to which Marx and Engels, and, following them, the whole school of German social democrats, refer with the utmost contempt. They do so completely in vain, because here, and here alone, not in the bourgeois stratum of workers, is to be found the mind as well as the might of the future social revolution. We will talk about this at greater length later on. For now, let us confine ourselves to drawing the following conclusion. In Italy, precisely because of the decided predominance of the destitute proletariat, the propaganda and organization of the International Working Men's Association took on the most passionate and truly popular character. As a result, the International's influence was not confined to the towns but immediately embraced the village population as well. Now the Italian government fully comprehends the danger of this movement and is trying with all its might to suppress it, but to no avail. It does not issue clamorous and bombastic diplomatic notes but acts as befits a police state, on the quiet. It smothers without explanations and without warning. In defiance of every law it shuts down all workers' associations, one after the other, with the exception only of those which count princes of the blood, government ministers, prefects, and other distinguished and respectable people as honorary members. It mercilessly persecutes the rest, seizing their records and funds and holding their members in its filthy jails for months at a time without trial and without even an inquest. There is no doubt that in acting in this fashion the Italian government is guided not just by its own wisdom but by the advice and instructions of the great Chancellor of Germany, just as in the past it obediently followed the orders of Napoleon III. The Italian state finds itself in a peculiar position. By virtue of the size of its population and the extent of its territory, it should count as one of the great powers. As it is, though financially ruined, corruptly organized, for all its efforts very badly disciplined, and, moreover, detested by the masses and even by the petty bourgeoisie, its real strength barely enables it to be deemed a power of the second magnitude. Therefore it needs a patron, a master outside of Italy, and it seems perfectly natural that with the fall of Napoleon III Prince Bismarck should take his place as the indispensable ally of this monarchy, which was created by Piedmontese intrigue on soil prepared by the patriotic efforts and exploits of Mazzini and Garibaldi VII. The hand of the great Chancellor of the Pan-German Empire now makes itself felt not just in Italy but throughout Europe, with the possible exceptions of England, which, however, does not look upon this emerging power with equanimity, and Spain, which was shielded from Germany's reactionary influence, at least at first, by its revolution as well as its geographical location. The new empire's influence is explained by its astounding victory over France. Everyone recognizes that by virtue of its circumstances, the enormous resources it has conquered, and its own internal organization, it now ranks incontestably first among the great European powers and is in a position to make each of the others feel its supremacy. That its influence must necessarily be reactionary cannot be doubted. Germany in its present form, unified by the brilliant and patriotic duplicity of Prince Bismarck, relies on the one hand on the exemplary organization and discipline of its army, which is prepared to suppress or cut down anything on earth and to commit every conceivable atrocity, at home or abroad, at the mere nod of its king emperor. It relies on the other hand on the patriotism of its loyal subjects, a boundless national ambition that goes back into ancient history, and the equally boundless worship of authority and obedience to it, for which the German nobility, the German bourgeoisie, the German bureaucracy, the German church, the entire guild of German scholars, and often, alas, under the combined influence, the German people too, are all distinguished to this day. Germany, I say, proud of the despotic constitutional power of its autocrat and sovereign, represents and embodies one of the two poles of contemporary social and political development, the pole of statism, the state reaction. Germany is a state par excellence, as France was under Louis XIV and Napoleon I, as Prussia has never ceased to be. From the time Frederick II completed the creation of the Prussian state, the question was, who would swallow up whom? Germany, Prussia, or Prussia, Germany. As it turned out, Prussia swallowed up Germany. Therefore, as long as Germany remains a state, regardless of any pseudo-liberal, constitutional, democratic, or even social democratic forms, it will of necessity be the paramount representative and constant source of every kind of despotism that may arise in Europe. Indeed, ever since the historical formation of the modern concept of the state in the mid-16th century, Germany, including the Austrian Empire to the extent that it is German, has never ceased to be the main center of all reactionary movements in Europe, even when the great crown freethinker Frederick II was corresponding with Voltaire. As a clever statesman, student of Machiavelli and teacher of Bismarck, he cursed everyone, God and man, including, of course, his correspondents the philosophers. He believed only in his reason of state, relying, as always, on the divine force of many battalions. God is always on the side of the strong battalions, he used to say, as well as on his economy and the utmost perfection of his internal administrative apparatus, a mechanical and despotic one, it goes without saying. In his opinion, and in ours as well, this is what really constitutes the entire essence of the state. Everything else is just a harmless grace note, its purpose being to beguile the tender feelings of people who cannot bear to face the harsh truth. Frederick II perfected and completed the state machine which his father and grandfather put together and for which his ancestors paved the way. In the hand of his worthy successor Prince Bismarck, his machine became an instrument for the conquest and potential Prussian Germanization of Europe. As we have said, From the Reformation onward, Germany never ceased to be the principal source of all reactionary movements in Europe. From the middle of the 16th century to 1815, the initiative for these movements belonged to Austria. From 1815 to 1866 it was shared between Austria and Prussia, although the former predominated while it was governed by old Prince Metternich, that is, until 1848. In 1815 our own tattered Germanic imperial native all the Russias joined this holy alliance of purely German reaction, more as a devoted admirer than an active participant. Impelled by a natural desire to evade their grave responsibility for all the abominations committed by the Holy Alliance, the Germans tried to convince themselves and others that their chief instigator was Russia. We are not the ones to defend Imperial Russia. Because of our deep love for the Russian people, because we passionately desire their utmost progress and liberty, we abhor that vile empire of all the Russias as no German can. In contrast to the German Social Democrats, whose program has as its prime objective the creation of a pan-German state, Russian social revolutionaries strive first of all for the complete destruction of our state, convinced as we are that as long as the principle of this state, in whatever form, hangs over our people, they will be poverty-stricken slaves. Therefore, not out of a desire to defend the policies of the Petersburg Cabinet, but in the name of truth, which is always and everywhere useful, we reply to the Germans as follows. Imperial Russia, in the person of two of its crowned hands, Alexander I and Nicholas I, did in fact give the appearance of intervening very actively in the internal affairs of Europe. Alexander roamed Europe from one end to the other and made a lot of fuss and noise. Nicholas called and made threats. But that was as far as it all went. They did nothing, not because they did not want to, but because they could not being allowed to by their friends, the Austrian and Prussian Germans. They were granted only the honorific role of bourgmestre, while Austria, Prussia, and eventually, under their supervision and with their permission, the French Bourbons, against Spain, acted. Only once did the Russian Empire go beyond its own frontiers, in 1849, and then in order to save the Austrian Empire, which was in the throes of the Hungarian uprising. In this century Russia has twice suppressed a Polish revolution, and both times with the aid of Prussia, which was just as interested in preserving Polish bondage as Russia was. It goes without saying that I am speaking of Imperial Russia. A Russia of the people is inconceivable without Polish freedom and independence. 9. Who can doubt that by its very nature the Russian Empire can wish to exert on Europe only the kind of influence that is most pernicious and opposed to freedom, that it greets every new act of state brutality and triumphant repression, every fresh instance of a popular uprising drowned in the people's blood, in any country whatsoever, with the most heartfelt sympathy. But that is not the question. The question is the extent of its real influence, by virtue of its intelligence, power, and wealth. Does it occupy such a dominant position in Europe as to have a determining voice in European affairs? We need only take a careful look at the history of the last 60 years, and at the very nature of our tattered Germanic Empire, to answer no. Russia is far from being as strong a power as it is fondly depicted in the boastful imaginations of archivist patriots, be the infantile imaginations of the Western and Southeastern Pan-Slavists, or the senile or panic-stricken imaginations of Europe's servo-liberals, who are ready to bow down before any military dictatorship, domestic or foreign, as long as it delivers them from the terrible danger their own proletariat poses. Anyone who looks soberly, guided neither by hope nor by fear, at the actual circumstances of the Petersburg Empire today, knows that on its own initiative, unless summoned by one of the great Western powers and in close alliance with it, it has never undertaken anything in the West or against the West, nor can it. Its entire policy from time immemorial has consisted of attaching itself to a foreign enterprise one way or another. And ever since the rapacious partition of Poland, which, as everyone knows, was conceived by Frederick II, who intended to propose to Catherine II that they divide up Sweden in the same way, Prussia is the Western power that has continually rendered this service to the Russian Empire. In regard to the revolutionary movement in Europe, Russia in the hands of Prussian statesmen served as a boogeyman, and often too, as a screen behind which the Prussians very skillfully conceal their own aggressive and reactionary enterprises. once the Crusade German army won its stunning series of victories in France. However, once French hegemony in Europe was definitively overthrown and replaced by pan-German hegemony, such a screen was no longer needed, and the new empire, which had fulfilled the most cherished dreams of German patriotism, emerged openly in all the glory of its aggressive might and systematic reaction. Yes, Berlin has now become the manifest head and capital of all vigorous and effective reaction in Europe, and Prince Bismarck its chief god and prime minister. I say vigorous and effective, not outmoded, reaction. Outmoded, senile reaction, predominantly Roman Catholic, still wanders like a sinister but impotent ghost through Rome, Versailles, to some degree Vienna and Brussels. Another kind, Petersburg reaction, not a ghost. Perhaps, but nonetheless senseless and without a future, continues to commit outrages within the confines of the Russian Empire. But vigorous, intelligent, truly powerful reaction from now on will be concentrated in Berlin and disseminated to all the countries of Europe from the new German Empire run by the statist, and thereby utterly anti-popular, genius of Prince Bismarck. This reaction is nothing other than the ultimate realization of the anti-popular idea of the modern state, the sole objective of which is to organize the most intensive exploitation of the people's labor for the benefit of capital concentrated in a very small number of hands. It signifies the triumphant reign of the Yidz-See of a bankocracy under the powerful protection of a fiscal, bureaucratic, and police regime which relies mainly on military force and is therefore in essence despotic, but cloaks itself in the parliamentary game of pseudo-constitutionalism. To achieve their fullest development, modern capitalist production and bank speculation require enormous centralized states, which alone are capable of subjecting the many millions of laborers to their exploitation. A federal organization, from below upward, of workers' associations, groups, communes, districts, and, ultimately, regions and nations, the sole condition for real as opposed to fictitious freedom, is as contrary to their essence as any kind of economic autonomy is incompatible with them. They get along very nicely, though, with so-called representative democracy. This latest form of the state, based on the pseudo-sovereignty of a sham popular will, supposedly expressed by pseudo-representatives of the people in sham popular assemblies, combines the two main conditions necessary for their success: state centralization, and the actual subordination of the sovereign people to the intellectual minority that governs them, supposedly representing them but invariably exploiting them. When we come to speak of the social and political program of the Marxists, the Lassalleans, and the German Social Democrats in general, we will have occasion to examine this factual truth more closely and to elucidate it. Let us turn our attention now to another side of the question. Any exploitation of the people's labor is a bitter pill for them, whatever the political forms of sham popular sovereignty and sham popular freedom that may gild it. Therefore no people will readily submit to it, however docile they may be by nature and however accustomed they may have grown to obeying authority. It requires constant coercion and compulsion, meaning police surveillance and military force. The modern state, in its essence and objectives, is necessarily a military state, and the military state necessarily becomes an aggressive state. If it does not conquer others, it will itself be conquered, for the simple reason that wherever force exists, it absolutely must be displayed or put into action. From this again it follows that the modern state must, without fail, be huge and powerful. That is the indispensable condition for its preservation. The modern state is analogous to capitalist production and bank speculation, which ultimately swallows up even capitalist production. For fear of bankruptcy, the latter must constantly broaden their scope at the expense of the small-scale production and speculation which they swallow up. They must strive to become unique, universal, worldwide. In just the same way the modern state, of necessity a military state, bears within itself the inevitable ambition to become a worldwide state. But a worldwide state, which obviously is unrealizable, could in any event exist only in the singular. Two such states, side by side, are a logical impossibility. Hegemony is only a modest, possible display of this unrealizable ambition inherent in every state. But the primary condition for hegemony is the relative impotence and subordination of at least all surrounding states. Thus the hegemony of France, as long as it existed, was conditional upon the impotence of Spain, Italy, and Germany. To this day, French statesmen, and foremost among them, of course, Thiers, cannot forgive Napoleon III for having allowed Italy and Germany to unify and consolidate themselves. Now France has vacated its position and has been replaced by the German state, which in our opinion is the only real state in Europe today. The French people without a doubt still have a great role to play in history, but France's career as a state is over. Anyone who knows anything about the character of the French will concur that if France was long able to be the preeminent power, it is absolutely impossible for it to be a second-rank state, or even one that is merely the equal of others. As a state, and as long as it is governed by statesmen, whether Thiers, Gambetta, or even Dukes of Orleans, it will never become reconciled to its humiliation. It will make preparations for a new war and will seek revenge and the restoration of its lost preeminence. Will it succeed? Decidedly not. There are a number of reasons for this. Let us mention the two main ones. Recent events have shown that patriotism, the highest state virtue, the heart of the state strength, no longer exists at all in France. In the upper classes it now manifests itself only in the form of national vanity. But even that vanity has grown so weak, it has been extirpated to such a degree by bourgeois expediency and the bourgeois habit of sacrificing all ideals to practical interests, that during the last war it could no longer even temporarily, as it used to be able to do, make selfless heroes and patriots out of shopkeepers, dealers, stock market speculators, officers, generals, bureaucrats, capitalists, landowners, and Jesuit-educated nobles. They all behave like cowards and traitors, swearing to save their property and taking advantage of France's misfortune to intrigue against France. In the most brazen fashion they try to outdo each other in seeking the favor of the merciless and arrogant conqueror who had become the arbiter of France's fate. One and all, they preached submission and humility and prayed for peace at any price. Now all these depraved windbags have become nationalists again and boast of it, but this absurd and repulsive clamor of cheap heroes cannot drown out the resounding testimony of their baseness of yesterday. Incomparably more important is the fact that not even the rural population of France displayed a single drop of patriotism. Indeed, contrary to general expectations, the French peasant, from the moment he became a property owner, ceased to be a patriot. In Joan of Arc's time he bore France on his shoulders all by himself. In 1792 and subsequently he defended her against a military coalition of the whole of Europe. But the situation was different then, thanks to the cheap sale of church and noble estates. He had become the owner of the land he formerly worked as a slave, and he rightly feared that in the event of defeat the émigré nobles would return on the heels of the German troops and take back the property he had just acquired. Now, however, he did not have that fear and regarded with utter indifference the shameful defeat of his dear fatherland. Except in Alsace and Lorraine, where, strangely enough, as a kind of joke on the Germans, who stubbornly regard them as purely German provinces, unmistakable signs of patriotism manifested themselves. Throughout central France the peasants drove away the French and foreign volunteers who had taken up arms to save France. They refused them everything and often even handed them over to the Prussians, while greeting the Germans most hospitably. One can say quite truthfully that patriotism had been preserved only in the urban proletariat. In Paris, as in all the other provinces and towns of France, the proletariat alone wanted and demanded the arming of the nation and war to the death. And a strange thing happened. This brought down upon it all the hatred of the propertied classes, as though they were offended that their younger brothers, from Betta's expression, were displaying more virtue, more patriotic devotion than their elders. To a certain degree, however, the propertied classes were right. What motivated the urban proletariat was not pure patriotism in the old and strict sense of the word. Real patriotism is, of course, a highly honorable sentiment, but it is at the same time a narrow, exclusive, anti-humanistic, often simply bestial one. The only consistent patriot is the person who passionately loves his fatherland and everything that is his own, while passionately hating everything foreign. Exactly like our Slavophiles 11, not even a trace of such hatred has remained within the French urban proletariat. On the contrary, in recent decades, since 1848, say, or even much earlier, under the influence of socialist propaganda it has developed a positively fraternal attitude toward the proletariat of all countries, along with an equally decided indifference to the so-called grandeur and glory of France. The French workers opposed the war undertaken by the last Napoleon, and on its eve, in a manifesto signed by the Paris members of the International, loudly declared their sincere fraternal attitude toward the workers of Germany. Even when German troops entered France, the workers took up arms not against the German people but against German military despotism. The war began exactly 6 years after the founding of the International Working Men's Association and just 4 years after its first Congress in Geneva. In such a short time, not only in the French proletariat but among the workers of many other countries, especially the Latin ones, the International's propaganda had succeeded in giving rise to a world of ideas, opinions, and sentiments that were entirely new and extraordinarily broad-minded. It gave birth to a common international passion which absorbed nearly all the prejudices and narrow-mindedness of patriotic or parochial passions. This new outlook found triumphant expression in 1868 at a popular meeting, and where do you think? In what country? In Austria, in Vienna, in response to a series of political and patriotic proposals which the bourgeois Democrats of South Germany and Austria made jointly to the Viennese workers and which would have led to the solemn recognition and proclamation of a pan-German, one and individual fatherland. To their horror, the bourgeois Democrats heard the following reply: "What is this talk about a German fatherland? We are workers, and you are the ones who exploit us, who endlessly deceive and oppress us. All workers, whatever country they belong to, the exploited and oppressed proletarians of the whole world, are our brothers, and all bourgeois, the oppressors, rulers, overseers, and exploiters, are our enemies. The international camp of workers is our one and only fatherland. The international world of exploiters is a country alien and hostile to us." And to demonstrate the sincerity of their words, the Viennese workers immediately sent a congratulatory telegram to our Parisian brothers, the pioneers of worldwide worker emancipation. This reply of the Viennese workers, which, all political considerations aside, came straight from the depths of popular instinct, caused a great stir in Germany at the time. It frightened all the bourgeois Democrats, including the party's veteran leader, the venerable Dr. Johann Jacobi, while they defended not only their patriotic sentiments but the statist creed of the school of Lassalle and Marx. Probably on Marx's advice, Liebknecht, who is now considered one of the leaders of the Social Democrats in Germany but at that time was still a member of the Bourgeois Democratic Party, the defunct People's Party, immediately set out from Leipzig to Vienna to negotiate with the Viennese workers, whose political tactlessness had provoked such a scandal. 13 has to do him justice. He was so successful that a few months later, in August 1868, at the Nuremberg Congress of German Workers, all the representatives of the Austrian proletariat without any protest subscribed to the near-patriotic program of the Social Democratic Party. 14. But this only exposed the profound distinction that exists between the political orientation of the party's leaders, who are more or less educated and bourgeois, and the revolutionary instinct of the German, or at least the Austrian, proletariat itself. True, in Germany and in Austria this popular instinct has been suppressed and constantly diverted from its real objective by the propaganda of a party more political than social revolutionary, and since 1868 it has made little progress and has been unable to pass into the people's consciousness. By contrast, in the Latin countries, Belgium, Spain, Italy, and especially France, which are free of this yoke and the systematic corruption, it has undergone broad development, in full freedom, and has in fact turned into the revolutionary consciousness of the urban factory proletariat. As we have already noted, this consciousness of the universal character of social revolution and the solidarity of the proletariat of all countries, which is still so undeveloped among the workers of England, arose long ago within the French proletariat. It knew back in the 1790s that in struggling for its own equality and freedom it was liberating all mankind. Those great words, liberty, equality, and fraternity of the whole human race, today are often used as empty phrases but at that time were sincerely and deeply felt, and they are found in all the revolutionary songs of the day. They underlay the new social faith and social revolutionary passion of the French workers, becoming part of their nature, so to speak, and determining, even unconsciously and involuntarily, the direction of their thoughts, aspirations, and actions. When he makes a revolution, every French worker is fully convinced that he is making it not just for himself but for the whole world, and far more for the world than for himself. Practical politicians and radical Republicans of Gambetta's ilk have tried in vain to divert the French proletariat from this cosmopolitan orientation and convince it that it ought to concentrate on its own exclusively national concerns, which are bound up with the patriotic idea of the grandeur, glory, and political supremacy of the French state, that it ought to secure its own freedom and well-being within the state before dreaming about the liberation of all mankind or the whole world. Their efforts seem very sensible but are of no avail. You cannot remake nature, and this dream has become part of the nature of the French proletariat and has driven the last vestiges of state patriotism from its imagination and its heart. The events of 1870-71 demonstrated this fully. In every city of France, the proletariat demanded a universal call to arms and the formation of a militia against the Germans. There is no doubt that it would have realized its intentions had it not been paralyzed on the one hand by the ignominious fear and wholesale treachery of the majority of the bourgeois class, which preferred 1,000 times over to submit to the Prussians rather than put weapons in the hands of the proletariat. And, on the other, by the systematically reactionary counteractivity of the government of national defense in Paris and the equally anti-popular opposition of the dictator and patriot Gambetta in the provinces, in arming themselves against the German conquerors. However, to the extent that it was possible under the circumstances, the French workers were firmly convinced that they would be struggling as much for the freedom and rights of the German proletariat as for their own. Their concern was not with the grandeur and honor of the French state but with the proletariat's victory over the hated military force that was serving in the hands of the bourgeoisie as an instrument for enslaving them. They hated the German soldiers not because they were Germans but because they were soldiers. The troops theirs used against the Paris Commune were pure French, but they committed in a few days more crimes and atrocities than the German army did in the entire war. From now on, in relation to the proletariat, all troops, domestic or foreign, will be enemies, and the French workers know it. Therefore their militia was not in any way a patriotic one. The uprising of the Paris Commune against the Versailles Popular Assembly and against the savior of the fatherland, Thiers, carried out by the Paris workers in full view of the German forces which still surrounded the city, reveals and fully clarifies the one passion motivating the French proletariat today. Henceforth it will have and can have no other cause, no other objective, and no other word than a social revolutionary one. On the other hand, the uprising fully explains the unbridled frenzy that seized the hearts of the Versailles rulers and representatives, as well as the unprecedented atrocities committed under the direct supervision and with their blessing against the defeated communards. From the standpoint of state patriotism, the Parisian workers had in fact committed a terrible crime, in full view of the German army which had just routed the fatherland, shattered its national might and grandeur, and struck at the very heart of national honor. The workers, in the throes of a wild, cosmopolitan, social revolutionary passion, proclaimed the complete abolition of the French state, the dissolution of France's state unity as incompatible with the autonomy of France's communes. The Germans had merely diminished the frontiers and power of the political fatherland, while the workers wanted to annihilate it completely, and as though to flaunt their treasonous objective they threw down into the dust the Vendôme column, the majestic witness to France's past Chilo RY-15. From a political and patriotic point of view, what crime could compare with such unheard of sacrilege? And remember that the Paris proletariat did not commit it accidentally, under the influence of demagogues, nor in one of those moments of frenzied enthusiasm which one frequently encounters in the history of any nation, and especially the French. No, this time the Paris workers acted calmly and consciously. Their factual rejection of state patriotism was obviously an expression of strong popular passion, and not a fleeting passion but a deep, one might say carefully considered, one which transformed itself into the people's consciousness. This passion suddenly revealed itself before the frightened world as a bottomless pit ready to swallow up the whole of the existing social order. with all its institutions, comforts, privileges, and its entire civilization. With a clarity as terrible as it is unmistakable, these events demonstrated that henceforth there can be no reconciliation between the wild, hungry proletariat, gripped by social revolutionary passions and striving persistently for the creation of another world based on the principles of human truth, justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity, principles tolerated in respectable society only as the innocuous subject of rhetorical exercises, and the well-fed, educated world of the privileged classes, defending with desperate energy the state, legal, metaphysical, theological, and military and police order as the last stronghold now safeguarding their precious privilege of economic exploitation. Between these two worlds, I say, between the common laborers and educated society, which, as we all know, embodies every conceivable merit, beauty, and virtue, no reconciliation is possible. It is war to the death, not just in France but in the whole of Europe, and it can end only in the decisive victory of one side and the decisive defeat of the other. Either the bourgeois educated world must subdue and enslave the elemental force of the rebellious people so as to compel the laboring masses to work as before by force of bayonet, knout, or rod, lest, of course, by some god or other irrationally explained by science, which would lead directly to the full restoration of the state in its simplest form, a military dictatorship or empire, the only form possible at the present time. Or the workers will at last throw off their hated, centuries-old yoke and eradicate bourgeois exploitation and the bourgeois civilization that is based upon it, which means the triumph of social revolution, the obliteration of everything that bears the name of the state. The state on one side, social revolution on the other, those are the two poles whose antagonism constitutes the very essence of contemporary public life throughout Europe, though it is more palpable in France than in any other country. The world of the state, which embraces the whole of the bourgeoisie, including, of course, the bourgeoisified nobility, has found its focal point, its ultimate refuge and last defense, at Versailles. The social revolution, which suffered a terrible defeat in Paris but was by no means extinguished and not even vanquished, now embraces, as it always has, the entire urban factory proletariat and is already beginning to engage the rural population toward its tireless propaganda, at least in the south of France, where it is being conducted and disseminated on a very large scale. This hostile confrontation of two henceforth irreconcilable worlds is the second reason why it is absolutely impossible for France to become once again the paramount, predominant state. All the privileged strata of French society would doubtless love to restore their fatherland to that brilliant and imposing position. At the same time they are so filled with the passion for acquisition, for enrichment at whatever cost, and with anti-patriotic selfishness, that in order to achieve their patriotic objective they are prepared to sacrifice the possessions, life, and freedom of the proletariat, to be sure, but will not renounce a single one of their own privileges and would rather submit to a foreign yoke than give up their property or agree to the equalization of economic conditions or rights. What is now taking place before our eyes fully confirms what we have said. When Thiers' government officially announced to the Versailles Assembly that a final treaty had been concluded with the Berlin cabinet under which the German troops in September would evacuate the French provinces they still occupied, the majority of the Assembly, representing a coalition of the privileged classes, hung their heads. French stocks, representing their interests in a more real and vital sense, plummeted, as though after a state catastrophe. It turned out that the presence of the victorious German army, which was hateful, coercive, and shameful for France, was comfort, support, and salvation for the privileged French patriots, the representatives of bourgeois valor and bourgeois civilization, and its prospective departure was synonymous to them with a death sentence. So the strange patriotism of the French bourgeoisie seeks its salvation in the ignominious subjugation of the fatherland. Should anyone still have doubts on this score, we can point to any conservative French journal. It is well known how frightened, agitated, and infuriated all the branches of the reactionary party, Bonapartists, Legitimists, and Orleanists, were at the election of Baradet 16 as deputy from Paris. But who is this Baradet? One of the numerous mediocrities of Gambetta's party, a conservative by position, instinct, and inclination but with democratic and republican phrases, which, however, by no means impede but, on the contrary, very much assist the implementation of the most reactionary measures. In a word, a man between whom and revolution there is not and never has been anything in common, and who in 1870 and 1871 was one of the most ardent defenders of the bourgeois order in Lyons. But now, like many other bourgeois patriots, he finds it advantageous to operate under the standard of the by no means revolutionary Gambetta. Paris elected him in order to spite the President of the Republic, Thiers, and the monarchist, pseudo-popular assembly reigning in Versailles. And the election of this insignificant individual was enough to get the whole Conservative Party worked up. And do you know what their main argument was? The Germans. Open any journal and you will see how they threaten the French proletariat with the justifiable wrath of Prince Bismarck and his emperor. What patriotism! Indeed, they simply call upon the Germans for help against the French social revolution that threatens them. In their patriotic fight they even took the innocuous borrowed for a revolutionary socialist. These sentiments of the French bourgeoisie hold out little hope of restoring the state power and supremacy of France by means of the patriotism of the privileged classes. The patriotism of the French proletariat does not offer much hope either. The frontiers of its fatherland have now expanded to embrace a proletariat of the entire world in opposition to the whole bourgeoisie, including, of course, that of France. The declarations of the Paris Commune are categorical in this regard, while the sympathies which the French workers are now so clearly expressing for the Spanish Revolution prove that the era of state patriotism has passed for the French proletariat just as it has for the privileged classes. This is particularly true in the south of France, where the proletariat is manifesting an explicit desire for fraternal union with the Spanish proletariat and even for a popular federation with it based on emancipated labor and collective property, in defiance of all national distinctions and state boundaries. Given the absence of patriotism in all strata of French society and the open and implacable war now going on between them, how is a strong state to be restored? All the statesman skills of the aged President of the Republic will go for naught, and all the terrible sacrifices he has made on the altar of the political fatherland, such as the inhuman slaughter of the many tens of thousands of Paris Guerrillas, including women and children, and the equally inhuman deportation of tens of thousands of others to New Caledonia, will unquestionably prove useless. In vain Thiers struggles to re-establish credit and restore domestic calm, the old order, and the military power of France. The edifice of the state, rocked to its very foundations again and again by the antagonism between proletariat and bourgeoisie, is cracking and splitting and threatens to collapse at any moment. How is such an old, incurably old state to contend with the young and still robust German state? Henceforth, I repeat, France's role as the paramount power is over. The era of French political power has passed as irrevocably as the era of French literary classicism, monarchical and republican. All the old foundations of the state have rotted, and Thiers strives in vain to build his conservative republic, the old monarchist state with a renovated pseudo-republican facade, upon them. Likewise Gambetta, the leader of the present Radical Party and Thiers' heir apparent, promises in vain to build a new state, supposedly sincerely republican and democratic one, on supposedly new foundations, because those foundations do not and cannot exist. At the present time a serious, strong state can have but one sound foundation, military and bureaucratic centralization. Between a monarchy and the most democratic republic there is only one essential difference. In the former, the world of officialdom oppresses and robs the people for the greater profit of the privileged and property classes, as well as to line its own pockets, in the name of the monarch. In the latter, it oppresses and robs the people in exactly the same way, for the benefit of the same classes and the same pockets, but in the name of the people's will. In a republic of fictitious people, the legal nation supposedly represented by the state, smothers the real, live people. But it will scarcely be any easier on the people if the cudgel with which they are beaten is called the people's cudgel. The social question, the passion for social revolution, has now seized the French proletariat. That passion must either be satisfied or bridled and subdued. It can be satisfied, however, only when the state's power of coercion, the last bulwark of bourgeois interests, collapses. This means that no state, howsoever democratic its forms, not even the reddest political republic, a people's republic only in the sense of the line known as popular representation, is capable of giving the people what they need, the free organization of their own interest from below upward, without any interference, tutelage, or coercion from above. That is because no state, not even the most republican and democratic, not even the pseudo-popular state contemplated by Marx, in essence represents anything but government of the masses from above downward, by an educated and thereby privileged minority which supposedly understands the real interests of the people better than the people themselves. Thus it is absolutely impossible for the propertied and governing classes to satisfy the people's passion and the people's demands. One instrument remains, state coercion, in a word the state, for the state means coercion. Domination by means of coercion, camouflaged if possible but unceremonious and overt if need be. Gambetta is just as much a representative of bourgeois interests as Thiers himself. He too wants a strong state in the unconditional domination of the middle class, with the addition, perhaps, of the bourgeoisified stratum of workers, which in France makes up a very insignificant part of the proletariat as a whole. The difference between him and Thiers consists entirely of the fact that the latter, swayed by the biases and prejudices of his time, seeks support and salvation only from the extremely rich bourgeoisie and views with suspicion the tens or even hundreds of thousands of new claimants to government office from the petty bourgeoisie and the aforementioned class of workers who aspire to the bourgeoisie. While Gambetta, spurned by the upper classes who hitherto have been the exclusive rulers of France, seeks to base his political power, his Republican democratic dictatorship, on the vast and purely bourgeois majority who until now have been left out of the rewards and honors of state administration. He is convinced, however, and quite rightly, we believe, that once he succeeds in seizing power with the help of his majority, the richest classes, the bankers, big landowners, merchants, and industrialists, in short, all the important speculators who have enriched themselves more than anyone else on the people's labor, will turn to him, accept him, and seek his alliance and friendship. Nor, of course, will he spurn them, for as a true statesman he knows all too well that no state, particularly a strong one, can exist without their alliance and friendship. This means that Gambetta's state will be just as oppressive and ruinous for the people as any of its more candid but no more coercive predecessors. And precisely because it will be decked out in broad democratic forms, it will provide a rich and rapacious minority with a stronger and more reliable guarantee of their peaceful and intensive exploitation of the people's labor. As a statesman of the modern school, Gambetta has no fear at all of the most broadly democratic forms or of universal suffrage. He knows better than anyone how little assurance they offer to the people and how much to the individuals and classes who exploit them. He knows that governmental despotism is never so fierce and so powerful as when it rests on the fictitious representation of a fictitious popular will. Therefore, should the French proletariat get carried away by the promises of this ambitious lawyer, should Gambetta manage to fit this unruly proletariat onto the Procrustean bed of his democratic republic, there is no doubt that he would succeed in restoring the French state to its former grandeur and supremacy. But that is the problem, he cannot succeed. There is no force on earth, no political or religious instrument now capable of stifling the desire for economic liberation and social equality in the proletariat of any country, and especially in the French proletariat. Whatever Gambetta may do, whether he threatens with bayonets or caresses with words, he will not be able to cope with the Herculean force now latent in that desire, and he will never succeed in harnessing the laboring masses as before to the glittering chariot of the state. His flights of oratory will not fill in and smooth over the abyss that irrevocably separates the bourgeoisie from the proletariat, will not put an end to the desperate struggle between them. That struggle will require the application of all of the French state's resources and strength, so that it will have none left to maintain its external supremacy among the European states. How, then, is it to vie with Bismarck's empire? Whatever the French state patriots may say, and however they may boast, France as a state is condemned henceforth to occupy a modest, distinctly secondary position. Moreover, it will have to subordinate itself to the supreme leadership, the friendly tutelage, of the German Empire, just as the Italian state before 1870 subordinated itself to the policies of the French Empire. It is a position that may be quite profitable for the French speculators who are finding considerable consolation on the world market, but it is a highly unenviable one from the point of view of national vanity, with which the French state patriots are so replete. Until 1871 might have thought this vanity strong enough to thrust even the staunchest and most stubborn defenders of bourgeois privilege into social revolution, if only to save France from the shame of being vanquished and subjugated by the Germans. But after 1870 no one will expect this of them. Everyone knows that they will agree to any kind of shame, even submission to German protection, rather than renounce their profitable dominion over their own proletariat. Is it not clear that the French state will never regain its former power? But does that mean that France's universal and progressive role has come to an end? Not at all. It means only that France, having irretrievably lost its grandeur as a state, will have to seek new grandeur in social revolution. In politics, as in high finance, swindling is considered valorous. Beekvass is a mildly alcoholic, generally home-brewed Russian beverage made from bread. The term Kvass patriots denotes unreflecting Russian chauvinists. See here, as in other places in the text, the Bakunin uses the derogatory Russian term for Jew, Zid. There is no doubt that the efforts of the English workers, who strive only for their own emancipation or the betterment of their own lot, redound to the benefit of all mankind. But the English do not know this and do not seek it. The French, on the contrary, know it and seek it, which in our opinion constitutes an enormous difference in favor of the French and gives all other revolutionary movements a truly universal significance and character. 2. But if not France, then what other state in Europe can compete with the new German Empire? Certainly not Great Britain. In the first place, England has never been a state in the strict, modern sense of the word, that is, in the sense of military, police, and bureaucratic centralization. Rather, England represents a federation of privileged interests, an autonomous society in which a landed aristocracy predominated at first and a moneyed aristocracy now predominates along with it, but in which, just like France though in somewhat different forms, the proletariat clearly and threateningly strives for the equalization of economic conditions and political rights. England's influence on the political affairs of continental Europe has always been great, to be sure, but it was based much more on wealth than on the organization of military force. Today, as everyone knows, it has diminished considerably. A mere 30 years ago, England would not have tolerated with such equanimity the Germans' conquest of the Rhine provinces, or the restoration of Russian predominance on the Black Sea, or the Russians' campaign against Khiva. 17 Such systematic acquiescence on its part demonstrates its unmistakable political bankruptcy, which grows with each passing year. The main reason for that bankruptcy is the antagonism between the world of the common laborers and the world of the exploiting, politically dominant bourgeoisie. In England, social revolution is much more imminent than people think, and nowhere else will it be as fierce, for nowhere else will it encounter such desperate and well-organized resistance. Spain and Italy need not even be mentioned. They will never become threatening or even strong states, not because they lack the material resources but because in both countries the spirit of the people draws them ineluctably toward an entirely different objective. Spain, led astray from its normal course by Catholic fanaticism and the despotism of Charles V and Philip II, and suddenly enriched not by its people's labor but by American silver and gold, in the 16th and 17th centuries tried to assume the unenviable honor of establishing a universal monarchy by force. It paid dearly for that. The period of its power was precisely the beginning of its intellectual, moral, and material impoverishment. After the brief and unnatural exertion of all its forces, which made it feared and hated by the whole of Europe and even succeeded in halting for a moment, but only for a moment, the progressive movement of European society, it seemed suddenly to have exhausted itself and fell into an extreme state of torpor, enfeeblement, and apathy. So it remained, utterly disgraced by the monstrous and idiotic rule of the Bourbons, until Napoleon I's predatory invasion aroused it from its centuries-long slumber. It turned out that Spain had not died. It delivered itself from a foreign yoke by means of a purely popular uprising and demonstrated that the masses, ignorant and unarmed, are capable of resisting the best armies in the world as long as they are animated by a strong and unanimous passion. Even more, Spain demonstrated that for the preservation of a people's liberty, strength, and passion, ignorance is preferable to bourgeois civilization. In vain the Germans plumed themselves on their own national, but far from popular, uprising of 1812 and 1813, and compare it with that of Spain. The Spaniards rose up defenseless against the enormous might of a hitherto invincible conqueror. The Germans, however, rose up against Napoleon only after the total defeat inflicted on him in Russia. Until then there was no instance of any German village or any German town daring to offer even the least resistance to the victorious French armies. The Germans were so used to obedience, that cardinal state virtue, that the conqueror's will became sacred to them as soon as it effectively replaced the will of the domestic authorities. The Prussian generals themselves, surrendering their fortresses, strongholds, and capitals one after the other, repeated the memorable words of the Berlin Commandant at the time, which became proverbial: order is the first duty of the citizen. The Tyrol was the lone exception. There, Napoleon met truly popular resistance. But the Tyrol, as everyone knows, constitutes the most backward and uneducated part of Germany, and its example found no imitators in any of the other provinces of enlightened Germany. A popular uprising, elemental, chaotic, and merciless in nature, 18 always presupposes a great loss and sacrifice of property, the people's own and that of others. The masses are always ready for such sacrifices. They constitute a rude, untamed force, capable of accomplishing heroic feats and achieving seemingly impossible objectives, precisely because they have very little property or none at all and are therefore not corrupted by it. When it is required for defense or for victory, they will not stop short of razing their own villages and towns, and since property for the most part belongs to others, they frequently evince a real passion for destruction. 19 This negative passion is far from sufficient for achieving the ultimate aims of the revolutionary cause. Without it, however, that cause would be inconceivable, impossible. For there can be no revolution without widespread and passionate destruction, a destruction salutary and fruitful precisely because out of it, and by means of it alone, new worlds are born and arise. Such destruction is incompatible with bourgeois consciousness, with bourgeois civilization, for the latter is built entirely on the fanatical worship of property. A burgher or a bourgeois would sooner give up his life, liberty, and honor than renounce his property. The very idea that it might be encroached upon, that it might be destroyed for any purpose whatsoever, strikes them as sacrilege. That is why they will never agree to the obliteration of their own cities and homes, even when the country's defense requires it, and that is why the French bourgeoisie in 1870 and the German burghers right up to 1813 submitted so readily to their fortunate conquerors. We have seen that the possession of property was enough to corrupt the French peasantry and extinguish its last spark of patriotism. To say a final word about Germany's so-called national uprising against Napoleon, let us reiterate that in the first place it ensued only when his shattered forces were fleeing Russia, and when the Prussian and other German corps, which not long before had been part of Napoleon's army, had gone over to the Russian side. In the second place, even then there was, strictly speaking, no universal popular uprising in Germany. The towns and villages remained calm, and only volunteer detachments of young people, students for the most part, were formed, and they were immediately incorporated into the regular army, something completely contrary to the method and spirit of popular uprisings. In short, in Germany youthful citizens, or, more precisely, loyal subjects, incited by the heated sermons of their philosophers and inflamed by the songs of their poets, took up arms to defend and restore the German state, for at this time the idea of a pan-German state had also awakened in Germany. Meanwhile, the Spanish people to a man rose up to defend the freedom of their homeland and the independence of national life against an arrogant and powerful marauder. Since then, Spain has not gone back to sleep but for 60 years has tormented itself in search of new forms for a new life. For Spain, what has it not tried, from absolute monarchy, twice restored, to the constitution of Queen Isabella, from Espartero to Narvaez, from Narvaez to Prim, and from the latter to King Amadeo, Sagasta, and Zorilla 20 Spain seemed to be trying out all the conceivable forms of constitutional monarchy, and they all proved too constricting, ruinous, impossible. now a conservative republic, the dominion of speculators, rich property owners, and bankers under republican forms, is turning out to be equally impossible. A petty-bourgeois political federation of the Swiss type will rapidly prove impossible too. The demon of revolutionary socialism has taken possession of Spain in earnest. The peasants of Andalusia and Extremadura, without asking anyone's permission or waiting for anyone's instructions, have been seizing the estates of the former landowners. Catalonia, led by Barcelona, is loudly declaring its independence, its autonomy. The people of Madrid are proclaiming a federal republic and refusing to subordinate the revolution to the future edicts of the Constituent Assembly. In the northern provinces, which were supposed to be in the grip of Carlist reaction, a social revolution is manifestly occurring. Furiosa and the independence of provinces and communes are being proclaimed, and all judicial and civil documents are being burned. Throughout Spain, soldiers are fraternizing with the people and ousting their officers. General bankruptcy, public and private, has begun, the primary condition for social and economic revolution. In a word, there is havoc and utter disintegration, and everything is collapsing of its own accord, smashed or broken as a result of its own decay. There are no revenues, no army, no courts, no police. There is no state power, there is no state. Only the people remain, strong and fresh, possessed now by a single social revolutionary passion. Under the collective leadership of the International and the Alliance of Social Revolutionaries, 21, they are rallying and organizing their forces, preparing to establish their own world of the liberated working men on the ruins of the disintegrating state and bourgeois world. Italy is just as close to social revolution as Spain. There too, despite all the endeavors of the constitutional monarchists, and even the heroic but futile efforts of the two great leaders, Mazzini and Garibaldi, the idea of the state has never been accepted, nor will it ever be, for it is contrary to the true spirit and the contemporary instinctive desires and material demands of the innumerable rural and urban proletariat. Like Spain, Italy long ago and irrevocably lost the centralizing and autocratic traditions of ancient Rome, traditions preserved in the books of Dante and Machiavelli, and in modern political literature, but not at all in the living memory of the people. Italy, I say, has preserved only the living tradition of absolute autonomy, autonomy not even of the province but of the commune. This is the sole political concept existing among the people. Add to it the historical and ethnographic diversity of provinces which speak such different dialects that the inhabitants of one have difficulty understanding the inhabitants of another, and sometimes cannot understand them at all. Then it becomes clear how far Italy is from realizing the modern political ideal of state unity. But this in no way signifies that Italy is socially disunited. On the contrary, for all the differences in dialects, customs, and mores, there is a common Italian character type by which an Italian can immediately be distinguished from a member of any other nation, even a southern one. Furthermore, a real community of material interests and an astonishing identity of moral and intellectual aspirations unite all the Italian provinces and bind them very closely together. It is remarkable, however, that all these interests and aspirations are directed against forcible political unity and are leading instead to the establishment of social unity. It can be said, and proved with countless facts drawn from current Italian life, that Italy's forcible political or state unity resulted in social disunity, and that consequently the abolition of the contemporary Italian state will assuredly result in its voluntary social unification. All of this applies, of course, only to the masses, for in the upper strata of the Italian bourgeoisie, as in other countries, state unity was accompanied by the social unity of the class of privileged exploiters of the people's labor, a unity which is now being developed and expanded. That class is now designated in Italy by the general term Consigliere 22. The Consigliere embraces the entire official world, the bureaucracy and the army, the police and the courts. The entire world of big property owners, industrialists, merchants, and bankers. Official and semi-official lawyers and writers, as well as the whole of Parliament, the right wing of which now enjoys all the benefits of government while the left strives to take the government into its own hands. Thus in Italy, as everywhere else, There exists a united and individual political world of predators, sucking the country dry in the name of the state and, for the greater benefit of the latter, reducing the former to an extreme degree of poverty and desperation. The most terrible poverty, however, even when it strikes a proletariat numbering in the many millions, is not a sufficient guarantee of revolution. Nature has given man an astonishing and, indeed, sometimes despairing, patience, and the devil knows what he will not endure when, along with poverty that condemns him to unheard of privations and slow starvation, he is also endowed with obtuseness, emotional numbness, lack of any consciousness of his rights, and the kind of imperturbability and obedience that particularly characterize the East Indians and the Germans, among all nations. Such a fellow will never take heart. He will die, but he will not rebel. But when he is driven to desperation, revolt becomes more of a possibility. Desperation is a sharp, passionate feeling. It draws him out of his dull, somnolent suffering and at least presupposes a more or less clear awareness that better conditions are possible, though he has no hope of achieving them. In the end, no one can remain in a state of desperation for long. It rapidly leads a man either to death or to action. To what kind of action? Obviously, action to liberate himself and to achieve the conditions for a better existence. In desperation, even a German will stop philosophizing. But it takes a great many insults and a great deal of oppression, suffering, and misfortune to drive him to it. Not even poverty and desperation, however, are enough to provoke a social revolution. They are capable of producing personal or, at most, local rebellions, but they are insufficient for arousing the people en masse. That requires a popular ideal, which always develops historically, from the depths of popular instinct, an instinct nurtured, broadened, and illuminated by a series of significant events, painful and bitter experiences. It requires a general conception of one's rights and a profound, passionate, one might say religious, belief in those rights. When such an ideal and such a belief are found in a people together with a poverty that drives them to desperation, then a social revolution is inevitable, it is imminent, and there is no force that can prevent it. The Italian people are in precisely such a situation. Their poverty, and the sufferings of every kind that they have endured, are terrible and do not fall far short of the poverty and sufferings that weigh upon the Russian people. But at the same time, the Italian proletariat to a much greater degree than ours has developed a passionate revolutionary consciousness which day by day grows clearer and stronger. Intelligent and passionate by nature, the Italian proletariat is at last beginning to understand what it needs and what it must desire for its complete and comprehensive liberation. In this respect, the Internationalist propaganda, which has been conducted energetically and on a broad scale only in the last 2 years, has rendered the proletariat an enormous service. It has given it, or, more accurately, has awakened within it, the ideal traced in broad outline by its deepest instinct, without which, as we have said, a popular uprising is absolutely impossible whatever the people's sufferings be. It has shown the proletariat the objective it must achieve and at the same time has indicated to it the ways and means of organizing a popular force. What this ideal represents for the people is, of course, first of all an end to want, an end to poverty, the full satisfaction of all material needs through collective labor equal and obligatory for all. Then, an end to all masters and domination of every kind, and the free construction of popular life in accordance with popular needs, not from above downward, as in the state, but from below upward, by the people themselves, dispensing with all governments and parliaments, a voluntary alliance of agricultural and factory worker associations, communes, provinces, and nations. And finally, in the more distant future, universal human brotherhood triumphing on the ruins of all the states. It is remarkable that in Italy, as in Spain, Marx's state communist program has had no success whatsoever. Instead, what has been widely and passionately adopted is the program of the notorious Alliance or League of Social Revolutionaries, which declared relentless war on every kind of domination, governmental tutelage, hierarchy, and authority. Under these conditions, a nation can liberate itself and can build its own life on the basis of the broadest freedom of each and all, but it can no longer threaten the freedom of other nations in any way. Therefore, neither on the part of Spain nor on the part of Italy should one anticipate a policy of aggression, but rather an imminent social revolution. Small states such as Switzerland, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, and Sweden, for the same reasons but chiefly because of their political insignificance, threaten no one. On the contrary, they have good reason to fear annexations on the part of the new German Empire. Austria, Russia, and Prussian Germany are left. As far as Austria is concerned, are we not speaking of an incapable India taking rapid strides toward the grave? This empire, a creation of dynastic ties and military force, is composed of four mutually antagonistic races, with little left lost among them. It is dominated by the German race, which is unanimously detested by the three others and numerically amounts to scarcely a quarter of the total population. And it is half made up of Slavs who are demanding autonomy and were recently divided between two states, one Magyar Slavic and the other German Slavic. 23 Such an empire could be held together only as long as military and police despotism prevailed within it. In the course of the last 25 years it suffered three mortal blows. A first defeat was inflicted on it by the Revolution of 1848, which put an end to the old regime and the government of Prince Metternich. Since then it has maintained its decrepit existence by taking heroic measures and a wide variety of restorative tactics. In 1849, having been saved by Emperor Nicholas, under the administration of an arrogant oligarch, Prince Schwarzenberg, and a Slavophile Jesuit, Count Thun, who drafted the Concordat with Rome, it began to seek salvation in the most desperate clerical and political reaction and in the introduction of the most complete and ruthless centralization in all its provinces, in defiance of national differences. 24 But a second defeat, inflicted on it by Napoleon III in 1859, proved that military and bureaucratic centralization could not save it. Since then it has gone in for liberalism. It summoned from Saxony the inept and hapless rival of Prince, then still Count, Bismarck, their leaders, and began desperately to liberate its peoples. 25 While liberating them, however, it also wanted to preserve its state unity, that is, to solve a problem that is simply insoluble. It had to satisfy simultaneously the four principal nationalities inhabiting the empire, the Slavs, Germans, Magyars, and Romanians, who are not only extremely divergent by nature, language, character, and cultural level, but for the most part regard each other with hostility and therefore can be kept together within the state only by means of governmental constraint. It had to satisfy the Germans, the majority of whom seek to attain the most liberal democratic constitution while demanding loudly and insistently that they retain their ancient right to political supremacy within the Austrian monarchy, regardless of the fact that together with the Jews they make up only a quarter of its total population. Is this not new evidence of that truth which we never tire of asserting, in the conviction that the quickest resolution of all social problems depends on its universal comprehension, that the state, any state, be it vested in the most liberal and democratic forms, is necessarily based on domination, on force, that is, on despotism, covert, perhaps, but all the more dangerous? The Germans, statists and bureaucrats by nature, it may be said, base their pretensions on their historic rights, meaning rights of conquest and antiquity, on the one hand, and on the fancied superiority of their culture, on the other. At the end of this foreword we will have occasion to indicate how far their pretensions go. For now let us confine ourselves to the Austrian Germans, though it is very difficult to separate their pretensions from those of the Germans in general. The Austrian Germans in recent years came to the grudging realization that they had to renounce domination over the Magyars, at least for the time being, and finally recognize their right to an independent existence. Of all the nationalities inhabiting the Austrian Empire, the Magyars, after the Germans, are the most state-minded. Despite the most brutal persecutions and the most drastic measures by which the Austrian government in the 9 years from 1850 to 1859 tried to overcome their stubbornness, they not only refused to renounce their national independence but asserted their right, also an historic one, in their opinion, to political supremacy over all the other nationalities inhabiting the Kingdom of Hungary, regardless of the fact that they themselves make up not much more than a third of the kingdom's population. Thus the hapless Austrian Empire split up into two states, almost equal in strength and united only under a single crown, the Cisleithanian, or Slavic German state, with 20,500,000 inhabitants, of whom 7,200,000 are Germans and Jews, 11,500,000 Slavs, and approximately 1,800,000 Italians and other nationalities, and the Transleithanian, Hungarian, or Magyar Slavic Romanian German state. It is remarkable that neither of these two states, even in its internal structure, offers any assurance of vigor, current or future. Within the Kingdom of Hungary, despite its liberal constitution and the unquestionable adroitness of its Magyar rulers, racial conflict, that chronic disease of the Austrian monarchy, has not abated in the least. The majority of the population, subordinated to the Magyars, dislikes them and will never voluntarily agree to bear their yoke. The result is an unrelenting struggle between them, in which the Slavs rely on the Turkish Slavs and the Romanians on the fraternal population of Wallachia, Moldavia, Bessarabia, and Bukovina. The Magyars, constituting but a third of the population, like it or not must seek support and protection in Vienna, Imperial Vienna, meanwhile, which cannot stomach the secession of the Magyars, like all decaying and declining dynastic governments, nourishes the secret hope of a miraculous restoration of its lost power. It is delighted at these internal discords which prevent the Kingdom of Hungary from achieving stability, and it covertly stirs up Slavic and Romanian passions against the Magyars. The Magyar rulers and politicians know this and return the favor by maintaining secret relations with Bismarck, who, foreseeing an inevitable war against an Austrian empire doomed to extinction, makes advances to the Magyars. The Cisleithanian or German Slavic state finds itself in no better a situation. Here, little more than 7 million Germans, including Jews, assert the claim to govern 11.5 million Slavs. This pretension, it goes without saying, is a strange one. One might say that it has been the historic mission of the Germans since ancient times to conquer the Slavic lands, to exterminate, subjugate, and civilize, that is, to Germanize or petty bourgeoisify, the Slavs. Hence a deep historical and mutual hatred arose between them, conditioned on both sides by the special situation of each one. The Slavs hate the Germans as peoples who have been vanquished but not reconciled, and in their hearts not subdued, hate all conquerors. The Germans hate the Slavs as masters customarily hate their slaves. They hate them for their hatred, which they, the Germans, have earned from the Slavs. They hate them for the involuntary and incessant fear aroused within them by the Slavs' inextinguishable thought and hope of liberation. Like all conquerors of a foreign land and subjugators of an alien people, the Germans with consummate injustice hate and scorn the Slavs simultaneously. We have already said why they hate them. They scorn them because the Slavs have been unable and unwilling to be Germanized. It is remarkable that the Prussian Germans bitterly and in all seriousness reproach the Austrian Germans, and practically accuse the Austrian government of treason, for being unable to Germanize the Slavs. In their view, and in actual fact, this constitutes the greatest crime against the patriotic interests of all Germans, against pan-Germanism. Threatened, or, more accurately, persecuted from all sides but not completely crushed by this detested pan-Germanism, the Austrian Slavs, with the exception of the Poles, have countered it with another highly repugnant absurdity, another ideal that is no less opposed to freedom and legal for the people, Pan-Slavism. We do not claim that all the Austrian Slavs, even aside from the Poles, worship this ideal, which is as grotesque as it is dangerous. Let us note in passing that the Turkish Slavs, for all the intrigues of the Russian agents who are always hanging around them, have shown very little sympathy for it. It is nonetheless true that the hope of deliverance and a deliverer from Petersburg is quite widespread among the Austrian Slavs. Their fierce, and, let us add, perfectly justifiable, hatred has driven them to such a degree of folly that they have forgotten or are ignorant of all the catastrophes Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, and even the great Russian people themselves have suffered under Muscovite and Petersburg despotism, and have come to expect salvation from our Tsar and out of all the Russias. That such ridiculous expectations could have arisen among the Slavic masses is not surprising. They know no history, nor do they know Russia's internal situation. All they have heard is that is a joke on the Germans, and in defiance of them, a huge, supposedly purely Slavic empire has arisen, so powerful that the hated Germans tremble before it. The Germans tremble, hence the Slavs must rejoice. The Germans hate, therefore the Slavs must love. That is all very natural. But it is strange, sad, and unforgivable that within the educated class in the Austro-Slavic lands a whole party has been created, headed by experienced, intelligent, knowledgeable people who openly advocate Pan-Slavism, or, at least, as some of them would have it, the liberation of the Slavic people by means of the powerful intervention of the Russian Empire, or, as others would have it, even the creation of the great Slavic Empire under the scepter of the Russian Tsar. It is remarkable to what degree that accursed German civilization, intrinsically bourgeois and thereby statist, has succeeded in penetrating the souls even of Slavic patriots. They were born into a Germanized bourgeois society, they studied in German schools and universities, they grew accustomed to thinking, feeling, and aspiring in German, and they would have become perfect Germans if not the goal they are pursuing been anti-German. By German ways and means they want to liberate the Slavs from the German yoke. Prevented by their German education from comprehending any other method of liberation than the formation of Slavic states or of a single mighty Slavic state, they are setting themselves a thoroughly German objective for the modern state of the centralized, bureaucratic, police and military type. The new German Empire, for example, or the Russian Empire, is a purely German creation. In Russia it originally had an admixture of Tatar elements, but because of the Tatars' Cortesa that is not an issue in Germany today. By their very nature and in their very being the Slavs are absolutely not a political, that is, state-minded, people. In vain the Czechs invoke the memory of their great Moravian Empire and the Serbs the Empire of Dusan 26. Those are either ephemeral phenomena or ancient myths. The truth is that no Slavic nation of its own accord ever created a state. The Polish monarchy republic arose under the dual influence of Germanism and Latinism after the total defeat of the peasants, the CHDOPY, and their enslavement to the gentry, who, according to the testimony of many Polish historians and writers, Mickiewicz, 27 among others, were not even of Slavic origin. The Bohemian or Czech Kingdom 28 was pasted together purely in the Germans' own image and likeness, and under their direct influence, as a result of which Bohemia so soon became an organic member, an inseparable part of the German Empire. Everyone knows the history of the formation of the Russian Empire. The Tatarnaut, Byzantine blessings, and German bureaucratic, military, and police enlightenment took part in it. The poor Great Russians, and then the other peoples who were annexed to the empire, the Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and Poles, participated in its creation only with their backs. Thus it is unquestionable that the Slavs, on their own initiative, never formed a state. They did not do so because they were never a conquering nation. Only conquering peoples create states, and they create them purely for their own benefit, at the expense of the peoples they have subjugated. The Slavs were preeminently peaceable and agricultural. Alien to the warlike spirit that animated the Germanic tribes, they were thereby alien to the statist aspirations the Germans manifested from early times. Living in their separate and independent communes, governed according to patriarchal custom by elders, but on an elective basis, and all making equal use of the commune's land, they did not have and did not recognize the nobility, nor did they even have a caste of priests. They were all equal and put into practice the idea of human brotherhood, though only in a patriarchal and consequently very imperfect form. There was no permanent political bond among the communes. When common danger threatened, such as an attack by an alien tribe, they would conclude a temporary defensive alliance, but as soon as the danger passed, this shadow of political unification disappeared. Hence, there was not and could not be a Slavic state. Instead, a social, fraternal bond existed among all the Slavic tribes, which were hospitable to the highest degree. Organized in this way, the Slavs would naturally prove defenseless against attacks and encroachments by warlike tribes, especially the Germans, seeking to extend their sway everywhere. The Slavs were partly wiped out but were for the most part subjugated by the Turks, Tatars, Magyars, and particularly the Germans. The second half of the 10th century marks the beginning of their tormented history of enslavement, not just tormented, however, but heroic as well. In the course of many centuries of stubborn and unremitting struggle against their conquerors, they shed a great deal of blood for the freedom of their land. In the 11th century we encounter two events: a general uprising of the pagan Slavs who dwelt between the Oder, the Elbe, and the Baltic, against the German knights and priests, and an equally significant revolt of the Polish peasants against the sway of the gentry. Then, until the 15th century, a small-scale, inconspicuous, but unceasing struggle was carried on by the West Slavs against the Germans, the South Slavs against the Turks, and the Northeastern Slavs against the Tatars. In the 15th century we encounter the great, and this time victorious as well as purely popular, revolution of the Czech Hussites 29. Leaving their religious views aside, let us note in passing, however, that they were far closer to the principles of human brotherhood and popular liberty than those of the Catholics or the Protestants who came after them. We note the purely social and anti-state character of this revolution. It was an uprising of the Slavic commune against the German state. In the 17th century, in consequence of a whole series of betrayals by the half-Germanized petty bourgeoisie of Prague, the Hussites were ultimately defeated. Almost half the Czech population was wiped out, and its lands were handed over to colonists from Germany. The Germans and Jesuits triumphed, and for more than 2 centuries after this bloody defeat the West Slavic world remained immobile, mute, held down by the Catholic Church and victorious Germanism. At the same time the South Slavs were dragging out their servile lot under Magyar dominance or the Turkish yoke. To make up for it, though, Slav rebellion in the name of popular and commercial principles flared up in the northeast. Passing over the desperate struggle of Novgorod the Great, Pskov, and other territories against the Muscovite Tsars in the 16th century, and the united militia of the Great Russian land against the King of Poland, the Jesuits, the Moscow Boyars, and the general domination of Moscow at the beginning of the 17th century, let us recall the celebrated uprising of the Ukrainian and Lithuanian population against the Polish gentry, followed by the even more determined uprising of the peasantry of the Volga region under the leadership of Stepan Razin. Finally, 100 years later, came the no less significant revolt of Pugachev. 30. In all these purely popular movements, insurrections, and revolts, we find the same hatred of the state, the same desire to create a peasant world of free communes. Finally, the 19th century can be called the century of the general awakening of the Slavic nation. Nothing need be said about Poland. It had never gone to sleep, for ever since the rapacious theft of its liberty, true, not the people's liberty but that of the gentry and the state, ever since it was partitioned among the 3 predatory powers, it had not stopped struggling, and whatever the Marathas 31 and the Bismarcks may do, it will keep on rebelling until it regains its liberty. Unfortunately for Poland, its leading parties, which are still drawn primarily from the gentry, have been unable to renounce their state-centered program. Instead of seeking the liberation and renewal of their homeland and social revolution, in obedience to ancient traditions they pursue those objectives now under the patronage of one Napoleon or the other, now in alliance with the Jesuits and the feudal lords of Austria. But in our century the West and South Slavs have also awakened. In defiance of all the Germans' political, police, and civilizing efforts, Bohemia after 3 centuries of slumber took heart anew as a purely Slavic country and became the natural focal point for the entire West Slavic movement. Turkish Serbia has come to play the same role for the South Slavic movement. With the Slavic revival, however, an extremely important, one might say fateful, question arises. How is a Slavic revival to be accomplished? By taking the ancient path of state domination, or by means of the real liberation of all peoples, or at least those of Europe, liberation of the entire European proletariat from every kind of yoke, and first of all from the yoke of the state? Can and should the Slavs extricate themselves from their foreign, primarily German yoke, the one they find most hateful, by resorting in their turn to the German method of conquest and usurpation, by forcing conquered masses to submit to a hated allegiance, formerly German but now Slavic? Or should they do so only by means of a joint uprising of the entire European proletariat, by means of a social revolution? The entire future of the Slavs depends on which of these 2 paths they choose. Which one should they resolve to take? We are convinced that to pose this question is to answer it. Despite the wise saying of King Solomon, the old never does repeat itself. the modern state, which merely brings to full realization the ancient idea of domination, just as Christianity is the realization of the latest form of theological belief or religious bondage, the bureaucratic, military, centralized police state, which strives by the intrinsic necessity of its very nature to usurp, subjugate, and stifle everything around it that lives, moves, and breathes. This state, which has found its ultimate expression in the Pan-German Empire, has outlived its time. Its days are numbered, and all peoples await their final deliverance from its downfall. Or the Slavs fated to repeat the answer that already stands condemned by history, an answer abhorrent to men and nations alike? For what purpose? It would be not an honor but a crime and a disgrace, and they would be cursed by their contemporaries and their descendants. Have the Slavs come to envy the Germans for the hatred they have earned from all the other peoples of Europe? Or do they like the role of universal God? The devil take all the Slavs and their whole military future if after their long years of bondage, torture, and silence they are to bring mankind new chains. And what use would it be to the Slavs? What benefit would there be for the Slavic masses in the formation of a great Slavic state? Such states are unquestionably of benefit, not for the many millions of proletarians, however, but for a privileged minority, priestly, noble, bourgeois, or, perhaps, even intellectual, one which in the name of its licensed erudition and fancied intellectual superiority considers itself called upon to take charge of the masses. The benefit is for a few thousand oppressors, hangmen, and exploiters of the proletariat. For the proletariat itself, for the masses of common laborers, the more extensive the state the heavier their chains and the narrower their prison walls. We have stated and demonstrated above that a society cannot be and cannot remain a state unless it becomes an aggressive one. The same competition which in the economic field destroys and swallows up small and even medium-sized capital funds, industrial establishments, landholdings, and merchant houses for the benefit of big ones, destroys and swallows up small and medium-sized states for the benefit of empires. Henceforth, any state that wants to exist not just on paper or by the grace of its neighbors for as long as they are pleased to tolerate it, but genuinely and independently, must without fail be aggressive. Being an aggressive state, however, means having to keep many millions of alien people forcibly subjugated. That requires the development of massive military force. And where military force triumphs, goodbye. Freedom. Goodbye, especially to the freedom and prosperity of the working people. Hence it follows that the formation of a great Slavic state would be nothing other than the massive enslavement of the Slavic people. But the Slavic proponents of the state will reply, we do not want one great Slavic state. We desire only the formation of several purely Slavic states of medium size, as a necessary guarantee of the Slavic people's independence. This sentiment is contrary to logic and to historical fact, to the very nature of things. No state of medium size can lead an independent existence today. Consequently, either there will be no Slavic state or there will be one huge and all-devouring Pan-Slav, St. Petersburg state. Moreover, would a Slavic state be able to combat the enormous power of the new Pan-German Empire without being equally enormous and powerful? Certainly one should never count on concerted action by a number of separate states bound together only by their interests. In the first place, a coalition of disparate organizations and forces, though in numbers it may equal or even exceed the forces of its opponents, is still weaker than the latter, for they are homogeneous and have a stronger and simpler organization, obedient to one thought and one will. In the second place, one should never count on concerted action by a number of sovereign powers even when their own interests demand such an alliance. Rulers of states, just like ordinary mortals, are for the most part afflicted with blindness, which keeps them from discerning the essential requirements of their own situation beyond the interests and passions of the moment. In 1863 it was in the direct interest of France, England, Sweden, and even Austria to take Poland's part against Russia, but none did so. In 1864 it was even more directly in the interest of England, France, particularly Sweden, and even Russia to intervene on behalf of Denmark, which was threatened by Prusso-Austrian, essentially Prusso-German, aggression, and again none did so. Finally, in 1870, England, Russia, and Austria, not to mention the small northern states, in their own obvious interest should have stopped the victorious invasion of France by Prussian German forces right up to Paris and almost to the south. Even this time none intervened, however, and only when a new German power that threatened everyone had been created did other states realize they should have intervened, but then it was too late. Therefore one should not count on the governmental wisdom of neighboring states but rather on one's own forces, and these should at least equal the forces of one's opponent. Consequently, no one Slavic state, on its own, would be in a position to resist the pressure of the Pan-German Empire. Would it not be possible, however, to oppose Pan-German centralization with a Pan-Slav Federation, a union of independent Slavic states or entities along the lines of North America or Switzerland? We must answer this question too, in the negative. First of all, for any such union to take place, the Russian Empire would have to disintegrate. It would have to be broken up into a number of separate and independent states, themselves linked only by a federal bond, because the independence and freedom of the small or even medium-sized Slavic states could not possibly be maintained in a federation with such a colossal empire. Let us even assume that the Petersburg Empire were broken up into a larger or smaller number of free entities, and that the independent states of Poland, Bohemia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and so forth, formed a great Slavic federation with them. Even in such a case, we maintain, this federation would be in no position to struggle against German centralization, for the simple reason that the preponderance of state and military power will always be on the side of centralization. A federation of states can guarantee bourgeois freedom to some extent, but it cannot create state and military power, precisely because it is a federation. State power necessarily demands centralization. We will be offered the examples of Switzerland and the United States. But Switzerland, precisely in order to augment its state and military forces, is now potently moving in the direction of centralization, while a federation has remained possible in North America only because the Great Republic does not have as its neighbors on the American continent any powerful centralized states of the order of Russia, Germany, or France. Thus, to counteract triumphant Pan-Germanism by means of state or political power, only one method remains: to create a Pan-Slav state. In all other respects this method is extremely disadvantageous for the Slavs, for it would inevitably entail their common bondage under the Russian knout. But is it at least a reliable method in respect to its objective of overthrowing German power and subjecting the Germans to a Pan-Slav, that is, an Imperial Petersburg, yoke? No, not only is it unreliable, it is assuredly insufficient. True, there are only 50,500,000 Germans in Europe, including, of course, the 9 million Austrian Germans. Let us assume that the dream of the German patriots finally came true and the German Empire came to include the Flemish part of Belgium, Holland, German Switzerland, the whole of Denmark, and even Sweden and Norway, altogether adding up to a population of a little over 50 million. What of it? Even then there would be at most 66 million Germans, while the Slavs number approximately 90 million. Therefore the Slavs are stronger in number than the Germans. Yet, despite the fact that the Slavic population of Europe exceeds the German population by almost a third, we still maintain that a Pan-Slav state would never equal the Pan-German Empire in terms of real state and military power. Why not? Because there is a passion for state order and state discipline in German blood, German instinct, and German tradition, while not only do the Slavs lack this passion, but wholly contrary passions dwell within them and act upon them. In order to discipline them, therefore, you have to keep them under the lash, whereas every German has swallowed the lash, freely and with conviction. His freedom consists of submitting to regimentation and gladly bowing down before authority of any kind. In addition, the Germans are serious and hard-working people. They are educated and economical, prudent, painstaking, and punctilious, which does not prevent them, when necessary, meaning when the authorities wish it, from being excellent fighters. They demonstrated that in their recent wars. Their military and administrative organization, moreover, has been brought to the highest possible degree of perfection, a level no other nation will ever attain. Is it imaginable, then, that the Slavs can compete with them in terms of state power? The Germans seek a life and liberty in the state, while to the Slavs the state is a coffin. The Slavs must seek their liberation outside of the state, not just in struggle against the German state but in an uprising of all nations against all states, in a social revolution. The Slavs can liberate themselves, they can destroy the hated German state, not through futile efforts to subject the Germans to their domination and make them slaves of their own Slavic state, but only by summoning them to universal liberty and universal brotherhood on the ruins of all existing states. But states do not topple of their own accord. They can only be toppled by a multinational, multiracial, worldwide social revolution. Organizing the popular forces to carry out such a revolution is the sole task of those people who sincerely desire the liberation of the Slavic race from its yoke of many years' duration. Those progressive individuals must understand that what constituted the weakness of the Slavic peoples in times past, their inability to form a state, today constitutes their strength, their right to the future, and lends meaning to all their current national movements. Despite the massive development of contemporary states, and as a consequence of it, for it is the thoroughly logical and inevitable effect of reducing the very principle of statehood to absurdity, it has become clear that the days of the state and of statism are numbered. The time is drawing near for the total liberation of the laboring masses and their free social organization from below upward, without governmental interference, from voluntary economic associations of the people, formed in disregard of all the old state boundaries and all national differences, on the sole basis of productive labor completely humanized and fully collective notwithstanding its great diversity. Progressive Slavs must finally understand that the time has passed for naive games of Slavic philology, and that there is nothing more ridiculous as well as more harmful and lethal for the people than to set up the false principle of nationality as the ideal of all popular aspirations. Nationality is not a universal human principle but an historical, local fact which has an undeniable right to general recognition, like any other real and harmless fact. Every nation, even a very small one, has its own character, its own particular way of life and manner of speaking, feeling, thinking, and behaving. These distinctive features are the essence of nationality, the product of a nation's entire history and conditions of existence. Every nation, like every individual, is of necessity what it is, and has an unquestionable right to be itself. So-called national rights consist precisely of this. But just because a nation or an individual has a certain identity and can have no other, it does not follow that they have a right, or would benefit by advancing such a right, to nationality or individuality as special principles, and that they should constantly preoccupy themselves with those principles. On the contrary, the less they think about themselves and the more they are filled with universal human content, the more the nationality of the one and the individuality of the other come to life and become meaningful. This is precisely the case with the Slavs. They will remain extremely insignificant and poor as long as they preoccupy themselves with their narrow, self-centered, and abstract Slavism, which is extraneous, and therefore adverse to the universal question and universal cause of humanity. They will win their rightful place in history and in the free brotherhood of nations as Slavs only when they are imbued like others with a universal ideal, a universal human ideal, prevailing over all other, more parochial or exclusively national interests, has existed in every period of history. The nation or nations that find a mission within themselves, that is, sufficient understanding, passion, and vigor to devote themselves exclusively to this universal ideal, are for the most part the ones that become historic nations. The prevailing ideal has differed from one period to another. Not too far back in history it was the highly aggressive ideal of the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church, not so much a human as a divine ideal and therefore contrary to popular freedom and well-being. The nations which then had the greatest inclination and capacity to devote themselves to it, the Germans, French, Spanish, to some degree the Poles, were, as a result, each in its own sphere, the preeminent nations. That period was followed by one of intellectual revival and religious revolt. The universal human ideal of the Renaissance first drew the Italians to the forefront, then the French, and to a much weaker degree the English, Dutch, and Germans. of religious revolt, which earlier had aroused the south of France, thrust or Slavic Hussites into prominence in the 15th century. After prolonged heroic struggle, the Hussites were crushed, just as the French Albigensians had been earlier. Then the Reformation revived the German, French, English, Dutch, Swiss, and Scandinavian peoples. In Germany, it very quickly lost the character of a revolt, which was alien to the German gentleman, and took on the aspect of a peaceful state reform, which forthwith became the basis for the most methodical, systematic, and scientific state despotism. In France, after a long and bloody struggle which to no small degree served the development of free thought in that country, it was overwhelmed by triumphant Catholicism. In Holland, England, and subsequently in the United States, however, it created a new civilization, essentially anti-state but economically bourgeois and liberal. Thus the movement of religious reformation, which encompassed nearly the whole of Europe in the 16th century, generated within civilized mankind two main orientations, one bourgeois liberal, headed chiefly by England and later by England and America. The other despotic statist, in essence also bourgeois and Protestant, though combined with a Catholic noble element, but wholly subordinated to the state. The principal representatives of the latter orientation were France and Germany, first Austria, then Prussia. The Great Revolution that marked the end of the 18th century again thrust France into the preeminent position. It created a new universal ideal, the ideal of absolute human liberty, but exclusively on the political plane. It is an ideal that contains an insoluble contradiction and is therefore unrealizable: political liberty without economic equality, and political liberty in general, that is, liberty within a state, are lies. Thus the French Revolution in turn generated two principal orientations, mutually antagonistic and perpetually struggling with each other but at the same time inseparable, we would even say inexorably converging, in their identical pursuit of one and the same objective, the systematic exploitation of the laboring proletariat for the benefit of a propertied minority which is constantly diminishing in numbers but growing richer and richer. One party wants to build a democratic republic on the exploitation of the people's labor. The other, which is more consistent, seeks to create a monarchical, that is, sincere, state despotism, a centralized, bureaucratic police state, a military dictatorship barely camouflaged with innocuous constitutional forms. The first party, under Gambada's leadership, is now trying to seize power in France. The second, led by Prince Bismarck, already holds sway in Prussian Germany. It is difficult to decide which of these two orientations is more beneficial for the people, or, more accurately, which of them will inflict the least harm and evil on the laboring masses, the proletariat. Both seek with the same stubborn passion to establish or to consolidate a strong state, that is, the absolute bondage of the proletariat. In opposition to these oppressive statist orientations, Republican and neo-monarchist, both products of the Great Bourgeois Revolution of 1789 and 1793, an entirely new orientation finally arose from the depths of the proletariat itself, first in France and Austria, then in the other countries of Europe. It proceeds directly to the abolition of all exploitation and all political or juridical as well as governmental and bureaucratic oppression, in other words, to the abolition of all classes through the equalization of economic conditions, and the abolition of the last buttress, the state. That is the program of social revolution. Thus at the present time all the countries of the civilized world face one universal question and share one universal ideal, the total and definitive liberation of the proletariat from economic exploitation and state oppression. Obviously, this question cannot be resolved without a fierce and bloody struggle, and the actual situation, and indeed the significance, of every nation will depend on the direction, nature, and degree of its participation in the struggle. Is it not clear, then, that the Slavs must seek and can attain their rights and their place in history and in the fraternal alliance of nations only through social revolution? But a social revolution cannot be a revolution of one nation alone. It is by nature an international revolution. Therefore the Slavs, in their quest for liberty and for the sake of their liberty, must join their aspirations and the organization of their national forces to the aspirations and national forces of all other countries, the Slavic proletariat must enter the International Working Men's Association (ONAS). We have already had occasion to mention the splendid avowal of international brotherhood in 1868 by the workers of Vienna, who refused to raise the pan-German standard despite the efforts of the Austrian and Swabian patriots to persuade them. They declared categorically that the workers of the entire world were their brothers and that they recognized no other camp than that of international proletarian solidarity. At the same time, they reasoned correctly in stating that as Austrian workers they could not raise any national standard because the Austrian proletariat consists of the most diverse nationalities, Magyars, Italian, Romanians, predominantly Slavs and Germans. Therefore they would have to seek a practical solution of their problems outside the framework of the so-called national state. A few more steps in this direction and the Austrian workers would have understood that liberation of the proletariat is absolutely impossible within the framework of any state, and that the primary condition for achieving it is to destroy every state. That is possible, however, only through concerted action by the proletariat of all countries, whose organization first on an economic basis is precisely the object of the International Working Men's Association. Once they had understood this, the German workers in Austria would have become the initiators not just of their own liberation but also of the liberation of the non-German masses in the empire, including, of course, all the Slavs. We would have been the first to urge the Slavs to form an alliance with them, having as its objective the destruction of the state, the people's prison, and the creation of a new international workers' world based on the principle of complete equality and liberty. But the Austrian workers did not take these necessary first steps because they were brought to an abrupt halt by the propaganda of Liebknecht and the other Social Democrats, who came with him to Vienna, I believe in July of 1868. Their objective was to direct the true social instinct of the Austrian workers away from the path of international revolution and toward political agitation for the establishment of a unified state, which they term popular but which obviously means pan-German, in short, for the realization of Bismarck's patriotic ideal but on a social-democratic basis and by means of so-called legal popular agitation. It is not just the Slavs who should refuse to take this path but the German workers as well, for the simple reason that the state, be it called popular 10 times over and embellished with the most highly democratic forms, will necessarily be a prison for the proletariat. It is even more impossible for the Slavs to follow this course, however, because it would mean submitting voluntarily to the German yoke, and that is repugnant to every Slavic heart. Therefore we will refrain from urging our Slavic brothers to join the ranks of the Social Democratic Party of the German workers, which is led first and foremost by Marx and Engels in a kind of triumvirate vested with dictatorial power, with Bethel, 32 Liebknecht, and a few Jewish literati behind them or under them. On the contrary, we must exert all our efforts to dissuade the Slavic proletariat from a suicidal alliance with this party, which is in no way a popular party but in its